Our story begins with a girl telling a man called Zunmo that his ambition led him to attempt a rebellion, and she asks why he didn't just stop wasting other people's time and admit his guilt straight away. She asks this in front of several people at that moment in a large hall, and the young man in a white dress and with chains in his hands replies that this is how things turned out. Everything was just the consequences of the actions that were taken. And then he asks the pink-haired girl if the poison in his body is her doing, and also tells them to take a good look, saying that it must have been administered through the glass of wine he drank yesterday, and then he asks if it was her who had done it, and then the girl stares at Zunmo and thinks that the minister was dismissed because of his great achievements, and then she asks if he still asks her why, and at that moment, she doesn't give Zunmo an answer, so she picks up a sword and tells him that she still remembers that he once had feelings for her, and that's why today, she's going to give him a reward. And seeing that pink-haired girl with the sword in her hand, Zunmo tells her that he went on a journey to find the Raoshi sword especially for her. And who would have thought that one day she would be pointed in his direction, and for a moment the girl stares at him, thoughtful, after he has said that, and then she remembers lying in bed and him arriving, and he told her not to worry about him, and she should go first, and then, at that moment, she tells him that he makes her disappointed, and then she continues, saying that he will be buried in the imperial mausoleum, and after his death, she will offer him gifts every year, and then, at that moment, she uses the sword to slash the boy, who quickly goes wide-eyed, and everyone who was present at that moment begins to tremble, witnessing that scene, and then Zunmo thinks that that was the end of him. It's time for him to activate the scripture of reincarnation, and then, suddenly, a blue butterfly appears, and then, it simply lands on Zunmo. There was Zunmo sitting down, and then he realizes and smiles. After going through a time travel and becoming the villainous prince of a novel, he had blocked all the protagonist's opportunities in order to avoid an inevitable fate, and he carefully trained the cultivation of the hero Liu Ruoxu in order to create a new dynasty, making her an empress, and even though he believed his plan was infallible, in the end, he couldn't change his fate, and he thinks that's enough. Since his plan went wrong, he won't make the same mistakes again, and at that moment, a man approaches, pulling back the curtain and calling Zunmo Mr. Marquis and asks him if he needs anything. And at that, Zunmo answers the man, saying that he's fine and also asks how long it is until they arrive, and at that, the boy replies that it will take half an hour to get to the orphanage. And at that, the young protagonist thinks about the orphanage, which is where he first met Liu Ruoxu, and the time is right, and at that, he answers the man saying that it's fine, and that he should continue, and the man answers the Marquis as he refers to Zunmo, saying that it was as he wished, and at that, Zunmo thinks that Liu Ruoxu is still a weak and helpless orphan. It's a pity that, this time, he's not going to train someone who will become an extraordinary being. And then, after 30 minutes, they arrive at the orphanage and their several children are trying on new clothes, and at that moment, Ruoxu is thinking, and at the same time wondering if she's back in the past, looking at her hands, and then she slaps both hands on her head, showing that she doesn't like it at all. Then we see a gigantic temple, where the girl is sitting on her throne, and then there were two subordinates, and one of them said to her, calling her majesty, that the coalition forces had invaded the palace, and for her safety, the best option was a temporary evacuation, and then he went on to say that yes, as long as she was alive, there was still hope, and then she asked the subordinate what he meant by hope, and he said that she was waiting for someone at that moment, and then the subordinate asked who his majesty was waiting for, until, completely unexpectedly, someone appears on the scene, breaking the tension with their sudden and threatening presence. The two subordinates accompanying Majesty Ruoxu immediately go into a state of high alert, as if they sensed the imminent danger represented by that figure. With quick and precise movements, one of the subordinates draws his sword, pointing it directly at the girl who had just arrived. With an aggressive tone full of hostility, he calls her a witch and, without hesitation, addresses the Majesty, calling for her to leave the place immediately, guaranteeing that he and his companion would take care of that intruder without mercy. However, the white-haired girl who had just appeared seems not to be shaken in the slightest by the words or actions of her subordinates, with a cold look and an expression that mixed disdain and amusement. She observes the scene for a brief moment before opening an enigmatic smile, with a tone almost as if it were something completely normal. She comments on the loyalty she saw between them, as if she were analyzing the situation in an almost scientific way. In a movement so fast that it could barely be followed by the eyes of those present, she strikes a fatal blow, ripping off the heads of the two subordinates without the slightest effort, their bodies falling to the ground as if they were mere puppets whose strings had been cut, leaving the atmosphere even heavier, with the same smile that exuded an unsettling mixture of tranquility and cruelty. The white-haired girl declared that, at last, there was no one else there to disturb her, for she wanted to say a few things to Ruixu, her voice carrying genuine satisfaction. Turning to Ruixu, she breaks the silence again, asking with a false sweetness how the Majesty has been. Her words, although apparently kind, carry a hidden weight, as if they were the tip of a blade ready to pierce. Ruixu, keeping her composure as best she can, responds with a tense and formal tone. Recognizing who was in front of her, she pronounces the name of the girl with white hair, Kao Yang. The simple name evokes buried memories and feelings, bringing up the past that Ruixu would rather forget. Kao Yang, for her part, wastes no time and, with a tone of voice that carries a mixture of irony and resentment, comments on how unexpected it was for her when Ruixu was taken by Zumo from the orphanage, because, for Kao Yang, it wasn't supposed to be Ruixu but her. She recalls how Ruixu was plucked from a world of misery to enjoy the glory, wealth, and status of Empress, while she, Kao Yang, was left behind, fighting over scraps of food with street dogs, surviving in the midst of a brutal reality and witnessing the worst atrocities the streets could offer. As Kao Yang speaks, her voice taking on a more cutting tone, and she slowly approaches Ruixu, each step echoing through the room. She makes a point of emphasizing that, despite everything, there was a catch. In the end, she says that Ruixu had lost to her. The question that follows is direct and full of provocation. Kao Yang asks if Ruixu knows why this happened, as if to prolong the suffering of the other before revealing the truth. Ruixu, unable to maintain her cool, responds with a trembling voice, asking the reason for that statement. Kao Yang then unleashes the answer with a calm that matches the intensity of the moment. She says that Ruixu had lost the moment she killed Zumo. That was the path that preceded ruin for her. The statement is like a blade cutting through the air, hitting Ruixu with devastating emotional force. Kao Yang continues, explaining that as long as Zumo was alive, it would be impossible for someone like her to even set foot in the territory of the Yan dynasty, let alone threaten its throne. The words are spoken with surgical precision, dismantling Ruixu little by little. Ruixu, stunned and completely emotionally shaken at that moment, tries to process what she has just heard, her voice trembling. She stammers out confused questions. Trying to understand what exactly Kao Yang was talking about, she pleads, almost desperately, wanting to know what she should do to correct her mistakes or appease Kao Yang's wrath. However, as Ruixu speaks, Kao Yang, without showing any hesitation, plunges his sword into the Empress's chest. The blow is precise, piercing Ruixu's heart, while Kao Yang maintains an icy and implacable gaze. As she carries out the attack, Kao Yang speaks, her voice laden with contempt. She accuses Ruixu of being drunk on power, stating that the Empress killed Zumo without feeling a single shred of remorse. And then, with a mixture of bitterness and scorn, she asks if Ruixu really believes that someone as foolish and corrupt as her deserves to be called Empress. Each word is an additional blow, hitting not only Ruixu's body, but also her soul, as she feels life ebbing away. Ruixu begins to think, reflecting on the actions that led her to that moment. She blames herself, believing that everything was, in fact, the consequence of her own mistakes. In her last thoughts, a single idea dominates her mind. If she could go back in time, she would never have done what she did to Zumo. Suddenly, she's thinking about how this could have happened, and a boy next to her asks her if she's alright, and she says that she is, and he says that she should go and put on her new clothes because the nobleman will be arriving soon to take one of them away, and she's wide-eyed, listening to the boy say that, and she thinks and wonders about the nobleman taking one of them away. And then she realizes something and thinks that it really is true. It was at that time that Zumo had adopted her in her previous life, and at that moment, she gets a little excited, thinking that there is still time, and she would meet Zumo again, and this time, she would do things the right way. And then the boy arrives, telling the children that they should go outside when they have finished changing their clothes. And then, in the courtyard of the orphanage, the children were smiling a lot. After all, there was a thread of hope that they could have a new reality if they were taken by the nobleman, and at that moment, Kao Yang was completely surprised, and at that, the boy sees her and calls her attention. Not liking what he was seeing at all, the boy shouts at her, asking what she came to do there. With a harsh tone in his voice, the boy tells her to go back inside and asks her what's on her mind. At this, the girl lowers her head and tells the man that she promised to stay quietly in the corner and that she wouldn't disturb or upset the nobles and that she'd like to see the nobleman. And she says this to the man, her cheeks flushed, trying to win his approval, just like the cat in boots. And then Zumo was there, and he asked the boy to let him see the children he had mentioned, and then Zumo saw Kao Yang and Ruoxu, and then the man asked him if he could please follow him, and then Zumo saw Liu Ruoxu and started to laugh mentally, thinking that in this life they won't have any kind of bond. He would like to do everything differently, and Ruoxu was completely stunned. Pity that Zumo had actually appeared. He was facing her, and at that, the man called Zumo a Lord Marquis and told him that they had tested all the bones of the children there, and with a smile on his face, he told Zumo that their level was well above that of normal people, being adopted to become slaves or being trained to become soldiers. The man makes it clear to Zumo that they are perfect for both choices, and by the way, he says that there is a child among them who has the best bone structure, and then he points, saying that it is that child, pointing to Ruoxu, and at that, Zumo already looks at her with disdain, and at that, the man says that in relation to the price of the little girl, he begins to laugh, saying that she will be a little more expensive. And Zumo tells the man that money has never been the problem, until he realizes that there's a white-haired girl over there and she's caught his eye. He thinks that feeling is familiar, and he wonders if she might be, and then he asks the boy about that little girl over there, pointing to the white-haired girl, and then the boy asks if the protagonist has taken an interest in Kao Yang. And in that tense moment full of conflicting emotions, the man raised his voice in a rude and contemptuous tone, stating that that girl was the worst they had there. He faced Zumo and coldly declared that her bones were weak, insinuating that she was worthless, his cutting words falling like relentless blows on the poor girl, who began to tremble visibly, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back the tears. However, it was no use. His words had struck deep into her already fragile self-esteem, and she seemed about to collapse. As the tears began to roll silently down her face, the memory of an even more humiliating moment surfaced. As if to intensify her suffering, she distinctly remembered a man, on a previous occasion, telling him with contempt that she should just get out of there. He had said that her presence was an affront to the nobles, and that it would be better if she didn't offend them any more with her insignificant existence. The memory brings a new wave of anguish, and the girl feels crushed by the weight of her own insignificance. In the space between these two facts, Zumo observes the scene with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity, his mind being invaded by an unexpected question. He thinks deeply and, at the same time, wonders what the outcome of that story would have been if, instead of Ruoxu, it had been that girl, the one who was now in front of him, full of tears, and with the appearance of someone who was carrying the weight of the world that he had chosen to take with him. The idea disturbs him and intrigues him too, making him look at her more attentively, as if he wanted to find something he hadn't realized yet. And then, as if responding to this moment of introspection, Zumo realizes something that seems obvious to him. He thinks that maybe it's her, that fragile girl who, despite everything, shows a kind of strength that can't be measured in muscles or power. While he ponders, the girl, with her eyes still full of tears, slowly raises her head, as if searching for courage somewhere inside, and then, with an impulsive and desperate gesture, she gets up from where she was and runs to hug Zumo. The gesture catches Zumo completely off guard. He stands rigid, not knowing how to react, while the girl grips him tightly. As if her life depended on that single act, she lets out a desperate cry, begging with all the emotion her voice can carry, she asks, or rather begs, for him to get her out of there. In the midst of her desperate words, she calls him young master, a title that seems to carry a weight of hope and submission. Even in the midst of crying, her voice somehow sounds firm when she declares that she is willing to work hard for him for the rest of her life, as long as he gives her a chance to get out of that hell. The scene takes an even more dramatic turn when the man who had previously humiliated her becomes furious with her attitude. Shouting angrily, he orders her to get away from Zumo immediately. In a sudden movement, he grabs the girl by the hair, ready to drag her away by force. However, before he can complete his action, Zumo's voice rises, firm and authoritative, asking him to stop. The order is so clear and loaded with authority that the man immediately obeys, reluctantly letting go of the girl. With the impact, the girl falls to the ground, but quickly gets up. As if driven by an even greater desperation, she clings to Zumo's clothes, her hands visibly shaking, her voice, equally trembling, pleads once again for him to take her with him. She calls him young master again, and her words are charged with a pleading so sincere that they seem to resonate in the air around them. The desperation was evident, and she practically bows, begging with all her might. If you've enjoyed the video so far and you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe, as this way you won't miss out on the updates. And if you haven't left your like yet, please leave your like, as it helps a lot. And if you want to help the channel in a deeper way and it makes sense to you, become a member of the channel. Members are entitled to watch the videos without interruption. Zumo, with a serious expression, looked at her and asked directly if she really wanted him to take her with him. The girl, trembling so much that it seemed as if her legs might give way at any moment, answered with an emphatic yes, while nodding repeatedly, as if to emphasize her determination. Then he asked her again, remembering that she had said she would do anything for him. Once again, the girl, her eyes watering and her voice broken by crying, reaffirms her promise. She declares that, as long as Zumo takes her away, she is willing to do anything for him. Without hesitation, a smile appears on Zumo's face. He seems to relax a little, perhaps picking up on the sincerity and determination behind the girl's words. With an unexpected gesture of kindness, he approaches her and begins to wipe away her tears. That small act of compassion seems to mean the world to the girl, who watches him with eyes full of hope. However, not far away, Ruixu witnesses everything that is happening. She remains motionless, but her expression reveals a mixture of shock and disbelief. Her eyes are wide, as if she can't believe what she is seeing, and her mind goes into a whirlwind of confused and conflicting thoughts. She thinks and, at the same time, wonders how the situation got to this point. In her perception, the story shouldn't have gone that way. It didn't make sense to her that Zumo would choose that girl over her. Everything seemed wrong, as if fate itself had made a mistake. As she watches Ko Young leave alongside Zumo, Ruixu feels a wave of emotions that are hard to describe. A bitter feeling began to grow in her heart. She thought that she was the one who should have been chosen, that she was the one who should have been by his side at that moment. For her, it was inconceivable that Zumo was wrong about her, but even so, the reality she was witnessing seemed to say otherwise. Something was terribly wrong, but Ruixu didn't know how to fix it, and she doesn't think so. She's the one who's chosen. And when the man sees Zumo leaving, he's completely shocked, thinking and at the same time wondering what happened there. And he also thinks that he had carefully chosen Ruixu, but he doesn't understand why he's interested in Ko Young's worthless girl. So he decides to ask Zumo, referring to him as the Marquis, if he's going to take any other children. At this, the protagonist, on his back, holding hands with Ko Young, asks the man if he has anything else to say to him, and at this, a little startled, the man replies that there are a lot of children there and Ruixu has exceptional talent, and at this, Ruixu stares at Zumo, and at this, the protagonist asks the man if by any chance he is imposing on him what he should do, and at that moment, the boy is in shock, wide-eyed, not hiding in the slightest that he was stunned by that question. He begins to tremble and says that that inferior being wouldn't dare, and at that moment Ruixu runs up to the protagonist, calling him Zu, but quickly correcting her speech and calling him Mr. Marquis. She pulls at his clothes and asks him to please take her with him, at which point the man orders Ruixu to stop doing that, calling her a stupid little girl. And then Ko Young continues, holding the boy by his clothes, and then the man, watching all that terrible agony at that moment, comments that it's a lot of petulance, one after the other, and asks if they don't realize that the protagonist is beyond their reach. And then, when the man pulls Ruixu, the protagonist asks the man to stop, and then the girl lets out a sigh, and at the same time thinks that that was a close call. And then she sees that he's holding Zumo's hand, leaving her in a state of doubt at that moment, and Ko Young in a state of distress, and then she smiles at him and her cheeks blush. Until suddenly Zumo simply shakes his hand so that the girl lets go, and then, with the force he uses, she ends up falling to the ground, and then she's completely perplexed at that moment, and then, wide-eyed, she asks if the protagonist isn't going to change his mind. And then, Zumo, with a faraway look in his eyes, reflects on Liu Ruixu. He thinks deeply about the time they spent together, a period that spanned hundreds of years. Despite all the shared history, he concludes that, in the end, certain bonds cannot be sustained, just as one cannot carry water with a sieve. It was a metaphor that perfectly captured the fragility of the bond that he had previously believed to be unbreakable. Full of determination, he decided that it was time to break that repetitive and unsustainable cycle. With a firm gesture, he turned around, interrupting any chance of reconsideration, and declared to the man in front of him that he would only take Ko Yang with him. His words accompanied by the gesture of holding the white-haired girl's hand, sealing his decision in a not at all wrong way. Meanwhile, Liu Ruixu remains slumped on the ground, watching the scene with a mixture of disbelief and despair. She feels the cold ground under her hands as her mind is lost in a whirlwind of chaotic thoughts. The inevitable question emerges from her trembling lips as to how things got to this point. Everything seemed to be spiraling out of her control, and the sight of Zumo holding Ko Young's hand as he left her behind was like a dagger through her heart. However, the man mediating the situation didn't seem willing to let things go that easily. He interrupted the scene by asking the Marquis to wait a moment. In an audacious tone, he declared that if Zumo wanted to take only Ko Young, he would have to pay a high price. He set the cost at 200 low-grade spirit rocks, or, alternatively, 2 medium-grade spirit rocks. The charge sounds absurd to the protagonist, who, with an enigmatic smile on his face, asks the man about these spiritual rocks. His tone, although apparently curious, carries a touch of challenge. He also questions whether the man really had the audacity to ask him something like that. The man, confused by Zumo's reaction, tries to understand what he was implying. He faces him and asks directly what the Marquis meant by those words. Zumo, maintaining the same nonchalant tone, asks the man another question, what he would do if he refused to pay. Zumo's calm and confident tone only increases the tension in the room, and the man, now irritated, raises his voice. He firmly declares that the Marquis would not get out of there so easily and orders the soldiers to appear immediately. Before the situation could even escalate completely, Zumo, with an air of disdain, asks if the man really believed he could do anything against him. It was then that, completely unexpectedly, the 2 men who had appeared to confront him were attacked so quickly that no one could even follow what was happening. The attack was almost invisible to the ordinary eye, and the man who had previously spoken with such confidence was now perplexed, unable to understand what had just happened, and without wasting any time, he shouted desperately, calling for reinforcements. In response, a veritable array of ninjas appears, advancing at the same time to try to subdue the protagonist. The scene turns into absolute chaos, with dozens of warriors moving towards Zumo. The man, now clearly terrified, orders them to eliminate the protagonist at any cost, stating that if they failed, everyone there would be condemned to death. However, Zumo was not alone. At his side, there was a man of imposing presence called Wang, whose skill was legendary. With a tone of unwavering confidence, Zumo turns to him and, almost casually, says that he will leave all those men in Wang's care. It was a clear demonstration of his confidence in his ally's abilities, and, indeed, Wang did not disappoint. In a matter of moments, he faces and defeats all the warriors who dared to challenge Zumo. The scene was worthy of legend. a single man facing the equivalent of an entire army and emerging victorious, his movements precise and lethal, and the battlefield quickly filled with silence, interrupted only by the groans of the defeated. Faced with this overwhelming display of power, the man who had insisted that Zumo take Liu Ruixu instead of Kao Yang fell to his knees, completely in shock, his previous arrogance and determination gone, replaced by pure fear. With a trembling voice and eyes full of despair, he begged for his life, addressing the Marquis with forced humility, offering him not only the spirit rocks he had previously demanded, but also any treasures or riches Zumo desired. The man's plea was an absolute contrast to his previous attitude, clearly demonstrating that he now understood the extent of the power he faced. And at the same time, the boy thinks as he bends down that since the Marquis is attached to the girl, Kao Yang, he has no choice but to use her as a hostage, and so he quickly goes towards the girl and opens his hand to take the girl with all his might. But just as he was about to do so, he simply loses his arm, which makes him completely stunned at that moment. Zumo had cut off the man's hand with his own, and then the boy stands there, trembling a lot, and then the protagonist tells the girl that from now on, no one but him can take charge of her life, and then Kao Yang, hearing everything, calls the protagonist a young master, and then Zumo puts the sword on the ground, giving the order to Kao Yang to kill that boy, and she becomes a little apprehensive at that moment. And the protagonist goes on to say that he bets she was constantly oppressed by him, and the girl remembers when she once knocked over a bowl of porridge and the man shouted at her, calling her worthless and asking if he had brought her there, so that she could make a loss, and he said that it was a waste, because a failure like her was eating more than the others, and out came the young girl with the broken bowl in her hands and her eyes full of tears, and he continued, telling Kao Yang that she was a failure, and asked her how she dared not kneel down when she saw him. And in that moment of growing tension, he stares at her with eyes full of hatred and fear, but tries to maintain some posture while letting out a cry of pain mixed with despair. The man asks, with a voice full of incredulity and irony, if the girl believes she is some kind of untouchable princess. Without warning, he pushes her brutally to the ground, making her fall awkwardly, and immediately throws punches at her, as if each blow was an attempt to repress his own impotence and anger. The girl, for her part, doesn't try to resist, but her thoughts are swirling. While he is assaulting her, she begins to harbor a burning desire for revenge, thinking about how she can put an end to the man who has humiliated her for so long, telling his boss that this is enough. If he carries on like this, she'll end up dying. Others begin to agree with whispers of approval, but the man, overcome by his fury, just glares fiercely at his subordinates, as if the mere fact that they suggest something is an outrage. Yet he relents for a moment, his fists still clenched, as he breathes heavily. The girl, slumped over and in intense pain, just stares at him, her eyes burning with a mixture of suffering and contained fury. Meanwhile, Zumo observes the scene with a neutral expression, but his eyes carry an intensity that reflects his understanding of the situation. He addresses Kao Yang in a calm but firm voice, exposing that man's character with cutting words, saying that that man, pointing at the boy, made filthy deals with powerful and wealthy people, selling innocent children as if they were disposable goods. He always treated her as less than nothing, as a tool that he could use and discard whenever he liked. Selling children, there is no more abominable act than that. With these words, Zumo walks slowly up to the girl, calmly. He stops beside her and looks directly into her eyes, calling Kao Yang's name, and he continues, saying that if she wants, she can end it now. It's in her hands. No one will blame her if she decides to take his life. In fact, it would be understandable, given the circumstances. He then points to a nearby sword, clearly suggesting that the girl make a decision with a hesitant but determined movement. Kao Yang picks up the sword that was lying on the ground. As he holds it, the metallic shine reflects off the man's face, who, realizing the seriousness of the situation, begins to panic. His voice, now trembling and laden with supplication, fills the room, asking her to please not do this and to let him go. He tells Kao Yang that she can't kill him and she should remember that it was he who saved her life. He begs, the pain and desperation making his words almost incomprehensible. Kao Yang, however, slowly advances towards him. She drags the tip of her sword across the ground, the metallic sound echoing like an omen. The man, unable to move because of his injuries, instinctively tries to retreat, but there is nowhere to go. He presses the area where his arm had been amputated, trying to contain the stabbing pain that consumes him. Amidst tears and despair, he continues, saying that if it wasn't for him, she would already be dead, and he saved her. And then he asks if that's how she thanks him, calling her a curse and also saying that she is an ingrate, a disgusting insect. His words only inflaming Ko Young's anger even more. Her eyes shone with a mixture of hatred and determination, and at that, she asked him about saving her life. Her voice was laden with contempt. She said that he never saved her, and he was only using her to make some kind of profit in the end. For him, she was never more than a disposable piece in his dirty schemes. She raised her sword and, without hesitation, slashed the man's leg. The blow is precise and brutal, and the blade pierces deeply. He lets out a deafening scream of pain, feeling his leg being rendered useless. Now, he was missing an arm and a leg, reduced to a deplorable state. The atmosphere is taken over by his screams and desperate pleas, asking her to please stop. He just asks her to stop it, and if she wants to kill him, to do it soon. She should end it once and for all, but he asks her not to keep mistreating him like that. Her voice, trembling and embittered, reflects the desperation of someone who knows they are on the verge of the end. Yet Ko Young remains motionless, her gaze impassive as if she were above any feeling of compassion at that moment. She completely ignores the man's pleas. For her, his suffering was not enough to make up for everything he had done. She felt that this was the fate he deserved, and her decision was already made. The man, reduced to a heap of pain and fear, cried and begged, but Ko Young didn't look away. Every second that passed was a reaffirmation of her strength and her determination to no longer be a victim, striking several blows to the man who asked her to please, for her to stop, and she said in a very firm tone of voice that she didn't want to, and so she continued to strike several blows, making that man suffer, instead of ending his life in one go. And at that, the protagonist approached her and said that Ko Young had done a good job, because the man was already dead. The sword was full of blood, and then, after she has heard Zumo say that, she drops the sword on the ground, and then she puts her hands together and says that she obeyed the orders that were given by her master, and Zumo tells her that by following him, anyone who dares to bother her will find the path to death. And then she takes Zumo's hand and just agrees with what he has just said. And then Wang asks the protagonist what they were going to do with the other orphans. And while he's walking with the white-haired girl, the protagonist responds to Wang by saying that he should send someone to bring a sum of money and let them find a way to survive. At which point Ruoxu shouts at him, asking him to wait, and she thinks, completely distressed, that no, she can't stay there, and she has to find a place to improve her cultivation. Then Zumo was sitting opposite the white-haired girl, Ko Young, and he asked her if she was hungry, and the girl answered him, saying that no, she wasn't. But for some reason she gave him that answer, her voice completely choked, and then she blushed and said that actually, maybe she was a little hungry, but in the end she was too embarrassed to tell him that she was hungry. And then, quickly, he gets her some food, saying that she can eat, and the girl is completely impressed at that moment. Her eyes were shining looking at that fish and the dumplings on the table. And then, the protagonist asks Ko Young what she is waiting for, and then she starts to eat the dumplings in a desperate way, as if she had never seen food in her life, and he asks her to eat slowly, so as not to cause bad digestion. And then, the protagonist, with a serious look and a calm voice, addresses the white-haired girl. He comments that perhaps he never mentioned this to her when they were still at the orphanage. But now was the time to clarify something important. He explains that, if she wishes to continue by his side, he will have to impose a restriction on her body. With this restriction established, he guarantees that she can never disobey his orders or try to hurt him in any way. He adds that if she breaks this rule, the consequences will be severe. Her soul would be sent straight into oblivion, a fate worse than death. However, the protagonist makes it clear that he doesn't intend to force her. He offers the girl a choice. She could start life again alone, leaving the past behind, or, if she preferred, she could accept her fate and move on alongside him, but with the restriction in place. The girl, still holding a dumpling in her hands and with her face slightly dirty from the crumbs, listens to every word attentively. Her eyes, although innocent, reflect determination. When he finishes speaking, she looks up at him and, with a firm expression, replies, calling him young master, and without any hesitation. She asks who he thinks thinks she is and states categorically that her decision has already been made. She made it clear that she would not go back on her choice. After hearing the conviction in her voice, the protagonist smiled slightly and said that this was great. With that, he instructed the girl to relax and not resist what was to come. Gently, but at the same time with authority, he placed his hand on her head. In an instant, it was as if invisible chains were forming around her, binding her to him in such a way that he couldn't remove the ties. The process, although intangible, seemed to carry a symbolic and real weight, connecting their existences definitively. As soon as the procedure was completed, the protagonist sighed with relief, thinking that the ritual had been successfully completed. Soon after, he surprises her by asking her to try to strike him. The girl, completely confused by the unusual request, looks at him in disbelief and asks what he is talking about. However, the protagonist keeps calm and repeats the instruction, reinforcing that she should try to attack him, still not understanding, but without the courage to disobey an order that was given by her young master. She tries to do what he asked. As soon as she tries to land a blow, a cry of pain comes quickly. She feels an intense and unexpected sting, enough to make her retreat immediately. Zumo, observing her reaction, calmly explains that this was the effect of the restriction he had placed on her. He adds that, in the future, if she tried to hurt him again, the consequences would be much more severe. The girl, with a tight heart and tears in her eyes, replied with determination, stating that she would never betray her young master. The sincerity in her voice was evident, and Zumo felt that she was speaking from the heart. At that moment, Wang, Zumo's faithful subordinate, intervened, informing them that they had finally arrived at the protagonist's mansion. Zumo, without wasting any time, asked Wang to arrange a room for Kao Yang and find someone to take her to the bathroom, as he had important matters to attend to and needed to go away for a while. With a friendly smile, Wang approaches Kao Yang and, in a welcoming tone, asks her to accompany him. As they walk through the wide corridors of the mansion, Wang maintains a relaxed conversation with Kao Yang, trying to put her at ease. He comments that, from that moment on, the mansion would be her new home, and that he had something special to show her. When they arrive in front of a door, Wang opens it carefully, revealing a spacious and well-decorated room, made with comfort and luxury in mind. He pointed to the room and informed her, with a smile, that this would be her room from now on. Kao Yang, upon seeing the space designated for her, felt her cheeks flush. It was something so beyond anything she could have expected. The room was large, with elegant furniture and windows that let natural light illuminate the room. The sight was so impressive that she couldn't contain her emotions. In the midst of all this, she thought that she wasn't worthy of living in such a wonderful place. With this overwhelming feeling, she began to run around the room, seemingly overwhelmed by a mixture of happiness and disbelief. As she ran, she told herself that she didn't deserve so much. One of the mansion's maids, assigned to help Kao Yang, observed the scene and was completely confused. Without understanding the girl's behavior, she gently asked what was going on and what the problem was. Kao Yang, however, doesn't answer immediately. She just continues to absorb the grandeur of her new home, struggling to accept that she was now part of a world that had previously seemed completely unreachable to her. And with her voice completely choked, almost as if she was having trouble organizing her words, Kao Yang, with her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, keeps her gaze down as she puts her fingertips together in a shy gesture. She tries to explain to Wang, with a hesitant tone, that it would be better if she lived somewhere more modest, something more compatible with her condition, something that wouldn't make her feel so out of place. However, Wang, known for his easygoing personality, can't hold back his laughter at the suggestion. He laughs because he finds the whole thing comical, and then says that she was personally chosen by the Marquis Zumo. He questions how it would be possible for her to live in a stable, adding that she is no horse, and that the Marquis would never allow anything so dishonorable. Kao Yang tries to argue again, looking for more justifications, but Wang doesn't pay the slightest attention to what she says. He simply turns his back on her, ending the conversation with a resolute tone. Before leaving, he casually comments that one of the maids will be sent to give her a bath and change her clothes. In addition, he promises that he will ask the head chef to prepare something special for her to eat, making it clear that she should feel at ease as she was now part of the Marquis mansion. Faced with Wang's words, Ko Yang feels her heart soar. She is completely dazzled, as if she were living a dream from which she didn't want to wake up. In a low voice, almost like a whisper, she murmurs to herself that the young master is incredibly good to her. Her mind begins to spin in thoughts about how she could repay everything she was receiving. Determined, Ko Yang decides at that moment that she would do anything to show her gratitude and loyalty to Zhu Mo, her young master. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Zhu Mo walked calmly through the busy streets, observing the people around him with a contemplative expression. He passed vendors, merchants, and passers-by, his thoughts occupied with something specific. He pondered the time and concluded that, if his calculations were correct, the item he was looking for had not yet been purchased by anyone. With that in mind, he hurried along, determined to reach his destination before anyone else. At that same moment, a young man in red clothes approached a merchandise stall. He examined the items on display with a critical eye before picking up a small jade pendant. Looking at it carefully, in a disparaging tone, he commented to the seller that the pendant was broken and tiny, stating that, at most, it would be worth 20 spirit rocks. The salesman, offended, shakes his head in denial and retorts that 20 spirit rocks don't even cover the costs he has incurred with that item. He demands at least 50 spirit rocks as fair payment. The red-robed boy, not wanting to pay so much, tries to negotiate again. He offers 30 spirit rocks, saying that it is a reasonable amount for what is being offered. The seller, however, doesn't give in, skilled in the art of persuasion. He insists that the price is unfair and that it's still too low, clearly trying to put pressure on the buyer. The heated negotiation between the two begins to attract the attention of passers-by. Suddenly, Zhu Mo appears on the scene, his imposing presence causing everyone around to stop and stare. Without hesitating, he interrupts the negotiation and declares loudly that he is willing to pay 100 spirit rocks for the jade pendant. His firm, authoritative voice leaves everyone surprised, especially the boy in the red dress, who immediately walks away in disbelief at what he has just heard. The salesman, visibly stunned, watches the Marquis Zhu Mo approach with calculated steps. With a confident movement, Zhu Mo throws a blue spirit rock onto the stall table, with such force that the impact creates a small hole in the wood. He looks directly into the vendor's eyes and, with an almost defiant tone, asks if 100 spirit rocks aren't enough or if there's a problem with the price he's offered. The vendor, recognizing who was in front of him, feels a chill run down his spine. He would never have imagined that Marquis Zhu Mo, such an influential figure, would show up at his humble stall. Nervously, he tries to change his approach. With a hurried tone, he begins to tell a story, claiming that the jade pendant was actually an heirloom from his family, passed down from generation to generation. He says that the item has inestimable sentimental value, trying to manipulate the situation to extract even more advantage. Zhu Mo, however, remains silent, watching the seller with an expression that made it clear that he was not easily fooled. The tension in the air was understandable, and everyone around was waiting anxiously to see how the negotiation would end. The protagonist, being completely surgical at that moment, asked the man if he was willing to sell a family heirloom for 50 spirit rocks, at which point the man said that since the Marquis wanted the pendant so badly, he would sell it for 100 spirit rocks. At which point the young man in the dress got angry and shouted at the salesman, saying that he had seen the jade pendant first, and then the salesman quickly throws the jade pendant into the protagonist's hands, and the younger boy, completely distressed, says that the salesman can't do that to him. And then Zhu Mo thinks, well, apparently he's still one step ahead of him, and that's Lin Yi, the hero of the novel. He's a wandering orphan who possesses a rare peculiarity, that of detecting spiritual objects. And after being lucky enough to find the ancient jade pendant, he embarked on the journey of immortality cultivation and changed his life, and he hopes that their paths don't cross again. He knocks Lin Yi down, and at that, the boy stays there on the ground, wondering who that Marquis is, and then he gets up and comments that the aura contained in that jade pendant is something he's never seen before in his life. He thinks that things are really bad for such a treasure for him to be in possession of the jade pendant, and he says that one day he will make Zhu Mo pay for what he did to him that day. He has a hatred for the Marquis, and he feels something and doesn't understand. He asks himself if a spirit creature has just been born and he starts to refuse, telling himself that it couldn't be possible and visibly surprised. He tells himself if there is a possibility that apart from the jade pendant, another great opportunity has just appeared. Then he goes over to check it out, and the scene changes to the young protagonist walking with that jade pendant in his hands and a blue energy exuding from the item, and suddenly, two different energies come out of the pendant, one blue and the other yellow, and he tells himself that they are still there, and that it is the book and the key to the spirit. By accessing the legendary secret realm of the Cloud Spirit, a place shrouded in mystery and power, reaching the longed-for celestial kingdom becomes an entirely plausible possibility. This enigmatic place, known as the Kingdom of the Cloud Spirit, is nothing less than the creation of an ancient immortal, whose exploits and legacy have transcended time. His name is whispered among sages and warriors, and tales of his mystical abilities are told like legends. This secret realm is much more than just a manifestation of the immortal's power. It is also a place where unimaginable opportunities await those who have the courage and determination to explore that place. It is said that the immortal, before disappearing from this world, left a series of immeasurable treasures in that place, relics of immense power and value, as well as hidden secrets capable of transforming anyone's destiny. According to the rumors spreading around the world, a mystical disc is the key to accessing this secret world, known as the Disc of the Spirit and the Cloud. This artifact is considered one of the most coveted items in history, because, in addition to allowing entry into this realm, it carries with it an aura of mystery that intrigues even the most experienced cultivators. The protagonist, Zumo, upon hearing about these stories and reflecting on what they mean, makes a firm and unshakable decision. In his mind, he promises himself that, in this life, he will no longer be a plaything of fate this time. He will take complete control of his own existence and shape the future with his own hands. Determined, he returns to his immense mansion, a symbol of his position, prestige, and power. As soon as he crosses the gates, Wang, his faithful servant, is waiting for him, as always punctual and attentive. With a respectful smile, Wang greets his master with cordial words, welcoming the Marquis back, then informs him that he has already installed the young woman the Marquis brought, Kao Yang, in the third bedroom of the East Wing, one of the most reserved and quiet places in the mansion. Wang also informs him that a meal has already been prepared for Zumo and asks him, carefully, if he would like him to go and fetch the girl. Zumo, with his usual calmness, replies that it won't be necessary. He'll go and fetch Kao Yang himself. Wang, always obedient and attentive to his master's wishes, just bows his head slightly in respect and replies simply that he has understood his Marquis, after which he leaves, allowing Zumo to go on his way. As he walks through the wide corridors of his mansion, Zumo observes the details around him, adorned tapestries, masterfully carved statues, and chandeliers sparkling with precious stones. Every corner of that building seemed to echo his greatness and authority. He says to himself, remembering Wang's words that it was the third room in the East Wing. After walking down long corridors and through several doors, he finally arrives at the indicated place. Stopping in front of the door, he reflects for a moment before saying quietly to himself that it must be that one. Without hesitating, Zumo approaches the door and opens it. Inside the room, the scene changes to Kao Yang, the white-haired young woman, who is being helped by two women. They are carefully bathing her in a white marble bathtub, whose fragrant steam rises into the room, creating a relaxing atmosphere. It was clear that she wasn't used to receiving this kind of treatment, and while the women washed her hair and cared for her skin, she commented that she found it all a bit complicated and different. In a moment of embarrassment, Kao Yang apologized to the two women, saying that she was sorry to be giving them so much trouble, but the women smiled kindly and reassured her that she didn't need to worry. They assure her that they are there to serve her and that it is a pleasure to take care of her. Kao Yang, still shy, thanks them and, with her cheeks even redder, admits, with a twinkle in her eye, that this is the first time in her life that she has had such a relaxing and comfortable bath. For her, the moment seemed almost unreal, as if she were living a dream. Suddenly, while the atmosphere seemed peaceful, voices began to be heard outside the door. A muffled conversation takes place, and someone asks the Marquis if anything has happened. Kao Yang's heart immediately races. She panics, feeling that her privacy is about to be invaded. With a trembling voice full of despair, she asks the women where her clothes are, looking around for a solution. She tries to cover as much as she can with her hands, but before she can take any action, the door opens. Zumo enters the room with his usual posture of authority and calm. Ko Yang, completely surprised and unable to avoid it, lets out a high-pitched scream, her voice echoing through the room. She shouts repeatedly, almost pleadingly, asking him to wait before entering, but realizing that there wasn't much she could do to change the situation, she quickly sinks into the bathtub, trying to hide as much as possible. Her cheeks, previously only flushed, were now an intense shade of red, and she wished with all her might that the earth could simply open up and swallow her up at that moment. And then, stammering, she asked what her young master had come to do there. And then, he closes the door and says that he was inopportune and apologizes to her for it. And the girl, her cheeks flushed, replies that it's okay, and after that, she quickly puts on her clothes, and then, a little embarrassed, she goes up to the protagonist and apologizes to him for having kept her young master waiting. And the protagonist comments to the girl that the dress suits her very well, and she, with her cheeks flushed, thanks her young master, and then he asks her to follow him, as there is something he wanted to give her after the meal, and she starts to follow the protagonist. And then a girl signals to her marquis that they should go that way, and then several subordinates are bowing, telling Zumo that the meal is ready. And just like that, there was a feast on the table, all kinds of dishes, which quickly left Ko Young completely impressed. Her cheeks flushed at the sight of all that food, and she started drooling. And then the protagonist asked her what she was waiting for, because that food was for her. And then she started eating. She immediately grabbed a chicken leg and a dumpling and started eating both together, but as quickly as possible. She comments that everything there is very tasty, and the boy, the protagonist's subordinate, is shocked by the girl, as she eats like Goku, and he asks her to go slowly, because the food won't run away from her, and she ignores what that man said to her and continues eating. She turns the bowl over and then says that it is now full. The girl next to the protagonist is extremely shocked at how Ko Young eats like a monster, and then both the boy, the girl, and the protagonist speak at the same time, asking the girl if doesn't think she's eaten too much. And so the girl's stomach is full, and then, with a low voice and flushed cheeks, she apologizes to all of them, and then she gets up and goes over to the protagonist, telling him that she swears she doesn't eat a lot. And then the protagonist doesn't pay much attention to what she's saying, and so he asks the boy next to him to tell the chef to prepare 3 meals a day starting today. And then the young man says that he understands and tells her that there will be 3 meals a day, and then the protagonist addresses the girl, saying that now that she is satisfied, she should go with him, and the girl just confirms what her young master said, and then they go to a place in the protagonist's mansion, and then he holds out his hand to her, handing her a parchment, leaving the girl with doubts at that moment. He says that it is for her. It was a scroll from the spirit of the cloud, and he asked her to read it and try practicing it. At this, the girl opened the scroll, and at this, he thought that the former outlaw witch was going to practice an extremely powerful technique, and he wondered at the same time what the result would be, and at this, the scene changed completely. With that merchant who tries to take advantage of others, he shouts angrily and breaks the rest of the jade pendant, saying that he was unlucky. There was something extraordinary hidden in that jade pendant, and if he had known that, he would have been much more meticulous. And he keeps complaining a lot, until an older man comes up to him and comments that it's a shame he hasn't found it yet. And at that, the man apologizes, saying that he didn't see it there, and at that, the old man says that there are still remnants of it there, and then he asks permission and says that he would like to ask the vendor a question, and at that, he asks if he had seen that jade pendant from the painting, leaving the vendor completely shocked at that moment. Then the scene changes to the protagonist holding Ko Young's head, and an energy was exuding from all sides. He was telling the girl to try to combine the energies of heaven and earth, and for her to absorb them into his body, and at the same time, he thought that one could imagine something like that from a witch, and he thought that Ko Young was extremely talented, and at that, the girl simply screamed. Her eyes go wide, and then she spits out a little blood, and she continues coughing and spitting out blood, leaving the protagonist with a tone of doubt at that moment, and he asks one of his subordinates to bring Dr. Zhang, and the subordinate gestures to his marquis and says that he understood very well. Then into the poor area. There was Lin Yi. He found a door, and he told himself that the glow was coming from there, quickly opening the door, and at that, he didn't understand. thinking and at the same time wondering if it was a girl. There was Ruoxu, and she was levitating, in a kind of meditation, and he was completely frustrated, thinking and at the same time wondering if she was the one he had thought was a great opportunity for him, until, just as he was leaving, he steps on a branch, breaking it, and the boy becomes nervous, regretting what he has just done, and at that moment, after he has broken the branch, the red-haired girl simply appears behind the boy, with the branch in her hands, touching his neck and asks who he is and visibly frightened. He replies that his name is Lin Yi, and he is a nomadic orphan, and he will be 15 this year. At this, Ruoxu is thinking, and at the same time wondering about Lin Yu, and if perhaps he is the same person, and she also thinks that she remembers that the minister introduced someone by the name of Lin. He said that he had a talent for discovering treasures, and that he would deliver all the treasures in the world to her. But Zumo had rejected him at the time, and so she wonders if perhaps he has already had contact with Lin Yi, and she also thinks that with his help, she could use the treasures to improve her cultivation, and so she throws the branch on the ground and Lin Yi stays on the ground, a little stunned at that moment, and comments that it was just a branch, and then the girl asks him what he thinks about him traveling with her for a while, and then he's a bit awkward, looking for words to say, saying that it's a bit strange for him. And then the scene changes to Ko Yang's room. The doctor is sitting on the bed where she was lying, and he tells Zumo that although the little girl has the mysterious body of the celestial plume, her constitution is deteriorating, which is why she eats too much, and Zumo asks the old man if he is telling him that she is not suitable for cultivation, and the old man replies that he can prepare a medicine to relieve the symptoms in her body. However, she will have to endure a great deal of pain during the training process, and at that, he hands Zumo a piece of paper, and at that, he also says that however, what he has just said is still only a palliative solution unless, and then, he stops talking, which makes Zumo's tension rise, and as if in a rush, he asks the doctor, unless what? And then, the doctor comments that unless the Marquis manages to find an ancient herb called the jade-colored herb, and then, Zumo is thinking about the name that the doctor has just told him. He puts the name of the jade-colored herb in his mind, and then, he thanks Dr. Zhang for going to take a look at the little girl, and then, he asks Ko Yang if she heard everything that the doctor had said, and she is completely shocked at that moment. At this, she simply gets out of bed and a little desperate. She tells her young master that she's going to work hard on her training, and at this, Zumo tells the girl that she'll suffer great pain, and at this, the girl replies to him, saying that as long as she's of help to her young master, she's not afraid of pain, and so she'll do it, and at this, Zumo turns his back on her and says that he hopes she can keep her promise and tells her that they'll be going on a trip tomorrow. And at that moment, the girl simply nodded in confirmation of everything the boy had just said to her, making it clear that she understood what was being said. She didn't say anything out loud, but her calm and attentive expression showed that she was absorbing his words carefully, while the boy turned his attention to a small bag in his hands. He looks at her briefly, as if to make sure that he is giving her what she really needs, and then explains that the herbs contained in that special sachet, carefully prepared, would be able to relieve, even if only temporarily, the pain she was feeling, in a calm and gentle way. He hands her the sachet. The girl, visibly touched by the boy's kindness, blushes a little, feeling a warmth on her cheeks, and, without hesitation, thanks Zumo with words full of gratitude. She calls him young master, expressing the respect she felt for him, and her voice sounds a little soft, but full of emotion. It was clear that she was touched by his gesture. The scene then shifts, and now night begins to fall, marking the end of another day. In the young woman's room, Ko Yang was calm and very happy. Apparently, she was lying on her bed, resting comfortably, and held the sachet given by Zumo in her hands. The young woman looked at him with a satisfied expression, almost as if she was examining the small package she had just received. The smile that formed on her face reflected her pride and happiness at having received that gift. After all, the girl had simply never received anything from anyone, nor had she ever had any attention from anyone. She had always been mistreated, so she treasured every moment when Zumo seemed to care about her. In her thoughts, she told herself that that very special sachet had been given to her by the young master, which made her feel even more special and grateful. She was amazed at the value of that simple but meaningful gesture. But after a few moments of reflection, she suddenly realized something, as if something had hit her. A look of confusion and worry appeared on her face, and she began to deny it to herself, repeating several times that she shouldn't get lost in thought and that she couldn't waste time. It was as if her mind was fighting against the feeling of satisfaction and responsibility she felt. She knew she couldn't let herself get carried away by something so simple, so she decided to start meditating, trying to concentrate in order to achieve more mental clarity. As she began her practice, she wondered if the pain she was feeling in her body was the same as the pain Zumo had mentioned. She knew she had to endure any difficulty that arose, and she repeated to herself, with determination, that she had to be strong and resist any challenge, without allowing herself to weaken. The scene then changes, and the next morning arrives, bringing with it a new opportunity to face what was to come. The protagonist enters the dining room with a calm step, looking around, and soon notices that the girl was already eating a lot. She, who was sitting at the table, raises her gaze as soon as he arrives and, with a friendly smile on her face, gives him a cheerful good morning. She explains that she was almost finished with her meal, which indicated that she had already eaten a lot. The protagonist, with a serene and calm expression, responds with a discreet smile, saying that everything happens in its own time. He assures her that there is no hurry and that they could leave when she has finished eating, with no need to rush or hurry. Then the young girl finally finishes eating, and, as she gets up, there is a slight impression that she is satisfied. Feeling full, she smiles, and her eyes sparkle as she says, with a tone of satisfaction, that she was completely full, indicating that the meal had completely satiated her. She, with her belly a little more prominent, looked really comfortable. The protagonist then observes the situation and asks the girl to hold on tight, asking her to try not to vomit, which leaves her momentarily confused, without understanding exactly what he meant. She is a little lost with those words, wondering what was going on and the reason for such a request. However, before she could fully understand the situation, something unexpected happened. Zumo, with the skill of a master, began to fly with impressive speed. He dragged the girl with him, and the young woman, unable to control herself, screamed in a tone of surprise and amazement, while holding on tightly to his clothes, trying not to be carried away by the speed of the movement. Her eyes were full of tears due to the fright and the force with which she was pulled, but she couldn't help but hold on tightly to his clothes so as not to be dragged away. The sensation of displacement was intense, but she tried in vain to adjust to the unexpected speed. The scene changed suddenly, and now they were in a completely different place. A vast and imposing mountain range called the Jade Dragon Range. The surrounding environment was mysterious and charged with a unique energy, as if the place itself was immersed in ancient secrets. Zumo, with a serious and focused tone of voice, speaks to the white-haired girl, indicating that they had finally reached a very special and secret place. It was a place in the depths of that mountain, an isolated and distant point that was accessible only to those who knew the region well and knew how to get there. The girl, hearing his words, feels a little more cautious, understanding the importance of that place and how far she was now from everything she knew. And he tells her that they'll find the jade-colored herb they need over there. So he asks the two of them to go straight away, except that the girl was still recovering from that intense flight she'd just had. And then they start to hear grunting, and the girl wonders what that sound was, until suddenly a huge tiger appears from behind the bush, and then it lunges at the protagonist and Ko Yang. At this, she shouts for her young master to be careful, but when she tries to dodge, he just does, and his claws are now close to her, leaving the girl completely stunned at that moment, her eyes wide, and at this, she closes her eyes and thinks, at the same time wondering if she is just a burden to her young master. And at this, Zumo says that he would never have thought that there would be so many scarlet amber herbs around. And at that moment, he used a skill to hold that creature. And then, he says that a mere beast doesn't deserve to have so many of them, and at that, he does in the same second. The tiger simply turns into a pile of bones, and then, the protagonist drops him on the ground, and suddenly, the tiger turns again into flesh and blood, and the girl is completely at a loss to understand what she has just seen. She goes wide-eyed and wonders how he turned into a skeleton, and then back to normal. And then the protagonist says that's the Heavenly Sutra of Reincarnation, and it's getting dark. It's time for them to prepare their meal, and then the protagonist picks up a red plant, and then he thinks for a while, and then he starts walking, saying that they should go now, because because there's a cave nearby, and then the little girl would stay there with him temporarily, and then the girl says it's okay and starts dragging that creature away. Then the scene changes to inside the cave, where the creature was being roasted and the girl was blowing on the fire, and then she takes a stick and sticks it into the meat, saying that the meat looks delicious, and then the protagonist tells her to control her breathing, and she gets scared, and then she looks at the entrance to the cave and asks who they are, and then the protagonist also sees it and says that they are members of a sect, which is strange to him. He explains to Ko Yang that that place is full of dangers, especially at night, and that's why hardly anyone comes there, and at that moment, the girl's cheeks flushed, calling for the young master. She had become visibly nervous, seeing those people there, and the protagonist continues, explaining to her that he doesn't know what they're planning, but if those people get in the way of his plans, he will annihilate them without hesitation. And the girl is completely shocked to hear him say that, as if it were something completely ordinary, and then, in the forest, Ruixu thinks it's really strange, as this is already the third batch today, seeing a boy running around, and she wonders why there are so many members of the sect there, until Lin Yi catches her eye, saying that there are traces of a battle, and then Ruixu is thinking that again, the spiritual herbs, the mirrored veil, the scarlet amber herb, and at that moment, the girl was lost in thought, reflecting carefully as she tried to understand the reason behind a mystery that seemed to bother her deeply. She pondered the question that intrigued her so much: why all those spiritual items, of such importance and value, disappeared so suddenly and mysteriously. Her mind began to cogitate possibilities, as if trying to piece together a complicated puzzle. She wondered if this was the work of the other members of the sect, or perhaps it was all connected to Zumo in some way. The uncertainty weighed heavily on her thoughts, leaving her restless, and with an evident discontent. It was difficult for her to deal with the lack of an answer. However, she quickly concluded that, regardless of the reason behind the disappearances, what remained to be done now was to focus on what was still possible. Determined, she thought that the next step would be to look for the alchemy furnace and start producing elixirs, a job that required concentration and patience, but which was essential for what she needed. As she ran, absorbed in her determination, Lin Yi, who was watching her closely, noticed her hurried movements and decided to ask her where she was going so urgently. With a firm and direct tone, the girl replies to him, saying that she was in search of a treasure, something that seemed to be of great importance to her. However, she also makes it clear that, if he was afraid, he didn't need to follow her, because he could very well stay right there. Without risking himself, without waiting for an answer, she goes back to running with determination, as if every second was precious. The boy, on the other hand, becomes a little uneasy when he sees her hurry and, showing some concern, comments that the place they were in was dangerous at night, especially for someone running alone. The scene then changes abruptly, and it is now morning. Inside a silent cave illuminated by the soft light of dawn, Ko Yang was lying down, apparently sound asleep. Little by little, she begins to wake up, feeling the light touching her face and disturbing her rest. When she opened her eyes and realized where she was, the girl said to herself that the pain she had felt during the night hadn't allowed her to practice as she would have liked. She looked a little frustrated, wondering if she had once again fainted due to exhaustion, at which point the protagonist, with a serene expression, approached her and gently touched her forehead, bringing her back to reality. He comments, with a tone that mixes surprise and admiration, that she had reached the 6th level of Kai refinement in the space of a few days. The girl, on hearing this, feels a wave of embarrassment, thinking that this was not as impressive as he made it sound. However, he continues talking, pointing out that she had achieved this remarkable feat despite her physical limitations and the constant pain she faced. It was something that really should be recognized as impressive. However, he also warns her about the risks. If she continued at this intense pace, her body might not be able to withstand so much pressure. The girl, feeling the need to justify her dedication, tries to explain herself, saying that her motivation was the desire to be useful to him, to be able to help him in some way. The protagonist, with an expression of concern mixed with understanding, does not prolong the conversation. Instead, he just said that they needed to leave as soon as possible, indicating the urgency of the situation. She, without hesitation, replied that she had understood what her young master meant, As they began to walk, he suddenly handed her a small potion, placing it carefully in her hands. The girl, confused by the unexpected gesture, looked at him, trying to understand why. He then explains that the next time she went to practice, she should take that medicine, as it would help to relieve some of the pain she used to feel during training. On hearing this, the girl can't help but smile shyly, and her cheeks blush slightly, indicating how touched she was by the consideration he was showing her. Then the boy resumes his walk, but not before telling her not to stand still and to follow him. She promptly replied that she had understood and then hurried to follow him. They continued walking through a dense, gloomy forest where the sunlight barely made it through the treetops. The atmosphere was silent, except for the subtle sounds of nature around them. However, there was something watching them, hidden in a high branch of an ancient tree. A menacing-looking snake remained motionless, its sharp eyes fixed on the two travelers. It seemed to be studying their movements carefully, waiting for the right moment to act. The girl asks her young master if the furnace they are looking for is something important, and the protagonist tells her that yes, its quality is above the others, and he tells her that it too should be just ahead. But he asks the girl to be careful because there are jade serpents with horns protecting the furnace, and he asks the little girl not to be hurt by them. They hear someone shouting at them to be careful, and the protagonist doesn't understand, wondering if there is someone there. So he quickly hides behind the bush and stares wide-eyed, seeing that it was him, Lin Yi, and that he was fighting one of those horned jade snakes with the help of a sword. And witnessing all this, the protagonist thinks, and at the same time wonders why the boy is there. But to Lin Yi's misfortune, he's attacked with all his might by that horned jade snake, causing him to spit out a little blood, and at that, he gets upset at that moment, ordering that horned jade snake to get out of there right away. But the snake doesn't hesitate for a second, and he tells himself that he has no choice. He would have to fight that creature anyway. And then he prepares himself and leaps towards the creature so that he can hit it with his sword, and the protagonist, witnessing all this, becomes a little apprehensive and says that Lin Yi is just an idiot, and Lin Yi shouts at that jade snake with horns, telling it to die, and for him, this time, it was going to die, until he opens his eyes wide. He had been surprised, and he doesn't understand, wondering how it happened. And then he wonders if it's serious, until the horned jade snake simply hits him with another blow, a blow so strong that he flies away, spitting blood and crashing into a wall, and it quickly travels to him, and while he's leaning against the wall, completely defenseless at that moment, the protagonist quickly appears to help Lin Yi, surprising the boy. And then Zumo says that it's their destiny to end up meeting, and now that he's been given the chance, he's going to take her core. And at that, the horned jade snake, seeing Zumo in front of it, simply starts preparing a skill that has a very strong light. Lin Yi is shocked, saying that then, the horned jade snake is able to use spiritual power. He is very frightened by this, and then she launches that attack on Zumo with all her strength, and the protagonist stands still. He receives the skill with everything, and then, after the dust settles, he emerges from that dust completely unharmed, and then he asks the horned jade serpent if this is all she has. He thought she had too little power to beat him, and this leaves the serpent herself completely stunned, and the boy too. And then the snake starts to move quickly, and at that moment, the protagonist calls Kao Yang, asking her to do something, and she tells the young master that she has understood, and then she makes an attack on the horned jade snake. But it defends itself, and the little girl thinks that this is not good, and with great fury, the snake goes to the girl so that it can hurt her with a bite. However, at that decisive moment, the protagonist doesn't allow the situation to get out of control, demonstrating an impressive and powerful skill. He uses a technique that projects a gigantic spiritual hand with immense precision and strength. He firmly grasps the horned jade snake, immobilizing it completely. The creature, once so threatening, is now trapped and unable to react. The protagonist, with an expression of determination on his face, coldly orders the snake to die. He concentrates all his strength on the skill, squeezing the creature with such intensity that the snake's body gives in to the crushing pressure. In an explosion of flesh and blood, it is torn apart, with remains scattered on the ground in a scene that demonstrates Zumo's overwhelming power. After dealing with the snake, Zumo immediately turns his attention to Kao Yang. Concerned about the girl's well-being, he quickly approaches her and, with a gentle tone, asks if she was hurt during the confrontation. Kao Yang, visibly crestfallen and with her eyes turned to the ground, replies to the protagonist, saying in a dejected tone of voice that she still felt very weak. She seemed disappointed in herself, as if she thought she hadn't made a significant contribution. However, Zumo doesn't agree with her assessment. He reassures her, stating with conviction that she is not weak and explaining that, thanks to her intervention, he has managed to obtain an inner core in perfect condition, something extremely valuable. As he spoke, Zumo displayed a glowing, pulsating green energy in his hand, the inner core of the jade serpent, which confused the girl even more. Realizing that she didn't understand the importance of what he was saying, Zumo set about explaining, telling her that, because of her interference at the time of the fight, the horned jade serpent wasn't able to perceive the imminent danger, which prevented it from panicking and releasing the deadly poison that would have contaminated the inner core. He emphasized that if the creature's poison had been released, the spiritual core would have been rendered useless, losing much of its value and spiritual energy. But thanks to Ko Young's courage and determination, the core remained intact and in perfect condition. When she heard these words, Ko Young was completely stunned. Her eyes widened in surprise and her cheeks took on a vibrant red hue. With a hesitant voice, she commented that this was what had happened, trying to assimilate the importance of her contribution. At that moment, Zumo, with a gentle smile on his face, runs his hand through her hair in an affectionate and reassuring gesture. He congratulates her sincerely, saying that she has done an excellent job, something he recognized and appreciated deeply. The unexpected compliment makes Ko Young blush even more. She was not used to receiving compliments, especially in situations where she felt inadequate. This thrilled her so much that she couldn't help but smile a little happily, while still trying to hide her embarrassment. For her, this moment was special, something she had never experienced before, and it filled her heart with joy. Just then, Zumo stood up nimbly and, with his usual tone of leadership, warned them that they needed to keep moving. He knew they couldn't waste any more time there. Ko Young, while following him, let himself be carried away by his thoughts. She reflected on how that had been the first real compliment she had ever received, something that, for her, was so meaningful and special that it made her feel important and useful. It made her extremely happy, and she smiled to herself, enjoying the moment. Meanwhile, in another place not too far away, Lin Yi was in a completely different state. He was visibly irritated and muttering quietly to himself. He recognized Zumo, and his presence bothered him deeply, his face full of frustration. Lin Yi asked himself questions, trying to understand why that man was there once again. He wondered if Zumo knew something that he didn't want anyone to know, a secret that he kept at all costs. This idea made him extremely upset and nervous, making him imagine the possible consequences if Zumo really did know something. Lin Yi's restlessness makes him make a sudden decision. Without thinking too much, he starts running, as if trying to escape his own fears and worries. However, before he can get very far, Zumo unexpectedly appears in front of him. The protagonist, with a fixed and penetrating gaze, interrupts Lin Yi's escape, firmly questioning where he thinks he is going. Zumo's imposing presence deeply frightens Lin Yi, who is paralyzed and unable to respond immediately. Nervousness takes over him, as he desperately tries to find an explanation or a way out of that uncomfortable situation. And then, he starts to shake a lot, and begins to stutter, saying that in fact, he wasn't actually going anywhere. And then the protagonist asks the boy if he's alone, and then the boy tries to find words to say to the protagonist, and then he frowns and comments that he's fallen behind. And then the protagonist tells him that he'll ask the last question, and then he asks if he's seen any of the cultivators. And the boy, still stammering, replies to the protagonist that he saw, and then he points to where they went. But he realizes that the protagonist has turned his back on him, and he catches Zumo's eye, and the protagonist doesn't pay much attention to him and continues walking, and the boy thinks, and at the same time wonders if he was going towards the cave, because that wouldn't be a very good thing, remembering Ruixu, because that's where she is. The scene then switches to inside the cave, and the protagonist comments that it's really strange. He wonders why there's a smell of blood in the place, until he sees something that leaves him with a tone of doubt and at the same time perplexed, getting wide-eyed. He wonders if the smell was coming from there, and then he sees that there was a pile of bones on the floor, and he puts his hand to his nose due to the discomfort of the stench. And he says that it's another discrepancy with the memories he has, and he continues walking, saying that they are disciples of the Storm Sect, and he asks himself what they have come to do in the Jade Dragon Mountain range, and he says that their cultivation is at the first and second stage of the spiritual realm, well below the level of the Horned Jade Snake, and this shouldn't have happened and they wouldn't have taken that risk. But that's it, and he starts analyzing a bag until he notices something and thinks that there's someone there, and he thinks that he has no answers. He opens the bag to take a look and thinks that finally he'd better check if it's still there, and he finds the object and says that everything is fine, because it was still there. But that voice from before, he asks if there was anyone else there and starts walking, saying that it was from there, and at that he was frustrated for a moment, until something happened. A person shouted for her to be freed, leaving the young protagonist in a state of alert. He quickly looked to the side where the sound of that voice echoing through the cave was coming from, and at that, he spoke Ko Yang's name, worried about her, and then he started walking, and at that, Ruixu was completely out of breath at that moment. She was hiding and thought that it was complicated, because who was really there was Zumo and the girl. Her eyes wide, said to herself that Ko Yang's witch was making Zumo work for her, and she was trying to take everything that was destined for her, and, unhappy with this, she saw a pile of bones over there and thought that it was all hers, and then she said that there was still the matter of the furnace, and then she began to look through the bags, searching, and she speaks while looking at a bag that wasn't there, and she realizes that Zumo must have taken it with him, and she kicks a bowl, saying that there's only garbage left. She gets extremely angry at that moment, and then she puts the idea in her head that she had to get out of there right away, running out of the cave, and there, outside the cave, there was Ko Yang, shouting for them to let her go. And at that moment, several beams of blue light shone brightly around Ko Yang, forming a circle that held her trapped and vulnerable. The rays seemed to emit a powerful energy, making any attempt to escape difficult. Several members of the sect watched the scene intently, their gazes full of suspicion and seeming to be angry at her presence. Among them, one of the disciples stepped forward, pointing at Ko Yang firmly. The stern expression on his face reflected the impatience of someone looking for immediate answers. He demanded that she explain herself, asking with an accusatory tone who she was and what was the reason for her presence in that place. Meanwhile, the other members remained still, but no less intimidated, staring at her with icy gazes, as if waiting for the right moment to act against her. Ko Yang, trapped and cornered, tried to free herself from the beams of light that restricted her. She reached out, touching one of the beams that surrounded her body, but immediately felt intense pain. The brightness of the light seemed to burn her skin, as if the spiritual energy was reacting against her. Unable to contain the pain, she screamed loudly, drawing the attention of everyone around. Yet, in the midst of the suffering, she managed to say, in a voice full of frustration, that she had already explained earlier. She didn't know who they were talking about, much less what they were implying. At that moment, one of the members of the sect approached a young man who appeared to be the leader of the group. He informed him that there were remnants of their aura inside the nearby cave, indicating that the previous occupants of that place had been killed. The leader of the group, a man with an imposing appearance and a stern look, immediately deduced that, in fact, the Horned Jade Snake had been defeated. He then turned his attention to Ko Yang, pointing at it again in an accusatory manner. With a tone of voice full of authority, he declared that that territory belonged to the snake, and that she, being only at the Kai refinement stage, shouldn't have been able to survive the confrontation with such a powerful creature. He demanded to know how she had escaped, but Ko Yang remained silent, his expression reflecting a mixture of annoyance and tension. She knew that any response could worsen her situation. Annoyed at the lack of answers, the sect leader took a step forward, moving even closer to the girl. Without hesitating, he grabbed Ko Yang by the neck, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing, his fingers tightly squeezing her throat, making it difficult for her to breathe. He glared at her, insisting on knowing where the Horned Jade Snake was and ordering her to speak immediately. The girl, struggling to breathe, tried to resist, but her strength was insignificant compared to his. The man, however, seemed not only interested in answers, his eyes traveled over her face, and, with a cynical smile, he commented that, despite everything, she was a very pretty young woman. Ko Yang, offended and furious, found the strength to say, between clenched teeth, that he should let her go immediately. Let her go immediately. Let her go immediately. The leader, however, was not intimidated. Instead, he threatened her coldly, saying that if she didn't explain what had really happened there, she shouldn't blame him for the consequences that could fall on her. The tension was palpable. The other members of the sect watched the scene in silence, waiting for the situation to unfold. But before he could act any further, something completely unexpected happened. In the blink of an eye, the man's arm, the one holding Ko Yang, was cut off cleanly and precisely. The movement was so fast that he didn't even have time to react. The pain took hold of him overwhelmingly, and he began to scream desperately, the sound of his despair echoing through the place. He looked at his own arm, or what was left of it, unable to believe what had just happened. The cut was perfect, as if an invisible blade had passed through it with surgical precision. While the man screamed, Ko Yang was left at the mercy of gravity. Without the support of the arm that held her, she fell to the ground with a painful impact. Despite the pain she felt when she hit the ground, she quickly gathered the strength to get up. The girl knew she had to act quickly. Around her, the other members of the sect were in a state of shock, completely bewildered by what had just happened. They immediately grabbed their weapons, their gazes moving frantically, trying to locate the person responsible for that sudden attack. Fear and uncertainty were evident in their expressions. They shouted, demanding that the attacker reveal himself, but they couldn't see anyone nearby. The atmosphere seemed dominated by a suffocating tension. Then, with an almost surreal calm, Zumo appeared, walking unhurriedly towards Ko Yang. His presence was unmistakable, and he seemed completely oblivious to the confusion around him. His expression was calm, showing no trace of concern. He approached the girl who was still trapped by the beams of blue light, ignoring the incredulous stares of the surrounding sect members. With a simple, firm movement, he raised his hand, touching the beams that bound Ko Yang, and undid them with ease. The energy that had previously held her immobilized vanished like smoke. Freeing her, Ko Yang, freed from the prison of light, felt a wave of relief, but her face soon took on a sad expression. Looking at Zumo, she apologized to him, her voice laden with regret. She said she was sorry to have been captured by those men, as if it were a personal failing. Zumo, however, just looked at her with understanding, without showing any sign of reproach. He knew that the situation was not her fault, and that his priority now was to ensure her safety. Meanwhile, the sect members continued to stare at him even more cautiously, aware that they were facing an opponent far beyond their capabilities. And then he hears someone calling him a bastard, and suddenly a legion of men with swords in their hands rush towards him. And then the man who had just lost his arm orders everyone to kill the bastard who has just done this to him, and makes it clear that he is still only in the Lingtai Kingdom. And then, just as he was about to be hit by those men, the protagonist looks at the girl, and he gives her some talismans and says that now it's her turn, and the girl tells him that it's okay, and then the men shout for both of them to die. Only when some of them are about to attack the girl, they don't understand, wondering if those were talismans of restraint, and suddenly they realize that their spiritual power has been sealed. And then, at that moment, everyone stands still. And then they saw Ko Yang exuding a blue energy. She seemed to have a lot of energy at that moment, leaving everyone wide-eyed, and then the protagonist asked the girl to leave only one of them alive, and she just agreed with what her young master said, and then she conjured up a kind of spear with her own energy and quickly leapt up to attack those men, and they scream, begging her not to take their lives. Now that the tables have turned, they want her to do nothing, otherwise they'll kill the girl and the protagonist in one fell swoop, without even thinking twice, and at that, the girl simply strikes several of them, leaving only one of them alive, which was the boy who had lost his arm, and the girl comments that as requested by her young master, there was one of them left, and she laughs a lot seeing that boy in that situation. And then she goes back to her young master, notifying him that she has already taken care of the others, and then she gives the man who had lost his arm a push, and he falls to the ground and starts foaming at the mouth. And then the girl, very happy because she was being useful at that moment, picks up several bags and tells the protagonist that there are their storage bags, and the protagonist tells her that she could keep all of that. And the girl doesn't understand why he said that, being completely stunned at that moment, and suddenly the protagonist begins to concentrate a large amount of energy in his hand, and then he throws that energy with everything towards the boy who had survived. And at that, obviously, the man screams, and Zumo, being quite cold, says that he will ask and the boy will answer. At that moment, the protagonist stared at the fallen man in front of him, maintaining the same serene and at the same time intimidating expression that seemed to squeeze any resistance from the boy. In a cold but direct tone, he asked a single question. He wanted to know the man's name. The simple inquiry seemed to have a crushing weight, because the man immediately became nervous. He began to tremble, but trying to mask his fear with anger, he answered in a hesitant voice, returning the question. He wanted to know who the man was who had dared to kill him and why he had murdered his fellow sect members. However, the protagonist, unmoved by the attempted confrontation, simply looked away from the man. His eyes met Ko Young's, and with a single glance, he gave a silent order. Ko Young, already used to his young master's subtle communication, immediately understood what he wanted. In one swift, fluid movement, she conjured her spear, which emerged shining brightly, radiating an intimidating energy. The sight of the weapon made the man, who until then had been trying to maintain some composure, completely panic. He began to scream, pleading with desperation. He said that his name was Yuz, and he was a true disciple of the Storm sect. He revealed this information as if he hoped it would save his life, as if the mere mention of his affiliation could appease the protagonist's stress. Hearing this, the protagonist tilted his head slightly, staring the man down, and then, in a serious and deliberate tone, pronounced his name, Yuz. It was as if the name carried a silent judgment. He continued, now asking coldly and clearly what the Storm sect had come to do there in the Jade Dragon mountain range. The question made Yuz tremble even more. He began to stutter, his words coming out in a disjointed way as he tried to organize his mind in the midst of fear. With a lot of effort, he finally answered, revealing that they were there in search of a legendary place, the so-called Cloud Spirit Realm. The mention of the Cloud Spirit Realm made the protagonist's eyes widen. He was visibly stunned, and, for a moment, his austere expression was replaced by something close to surprise. That information seemed completely unexpected. He asked what he meant by the Cloud Spirit Realm, as if he needed to confirm what he had just heard. Without wasting any time, he grabbed Yuz by the sleeve, lifting him off the ground with a force that seemed disproportionate to his appearance. The tone of his voice was now more intense, demanding to know where the man had obtained such information. Yuz, terrified, answered quickly, without even hesitating. He said that the information came from an elder of the Green Vine sect, an organization that also seemed to be involved in mysteries of that kind. At this, the protagonist asked where the Green Vine sect got this information. The protagonist pressed even closer, bringing his face to Yuz, while Ko Young's gaze remained fixed on the scene, silently observing the relentless interrogation. Yuz began to cough nervously, trying to give an answer. He said that this was all he knew. His voice was very shaky and full of despair. There was nothing more he could say. Faced with this, the protagonist, without showing any sign of emotion, let go of the man, letting him fall to the ground as if he were a disposable object. Yuz, in complete desperation, begged for his life, calling the protagonist a veteran in a submissive tone. He begged for his life to be spared, clinging to the hope that his words might somehow move that cold man. However, the protagonist, looking down at him, murmured with an almost indifferent tone, "What a shame," and then, his hand began to exude an intense blue energy, so bright that it illuminated the surroundings. "But there's a catch," continued the protagonist, his tone even more threatening now. "You really need to die." Before Yuz could reply, beg, or even scream, the protagonist ended his life abruptly and ruthlessly. In a single movement, he channeled all the energy accumulated in his hand and, with one devastating blow, instantly blew up Yuz. The man's body shattered into fragments, and the sound of the explosion echoed through the silent forest. Kao Yang watched it all with wide eyes, completely stunned. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed, although she already knew the overwhelming strength of her young master. Zumo's cold and decisive act still left her surprised. It was as if he hadn't hesitated for a second to eliminate his enemy. Zumo, however, remained unshaken. He turned to Kao Yang and, in a calm but firm voice, called out to her, saying that they needed to get out of there immediately. The girl, still impacted by what she had just witnessed, just shook her head in agreement, following her young master without saying a word. As they walked through the dense forest, a new observer revealed himself. High up in a tree, Lin Yi was sitting on a branch, observing everything from afar. His expression was charged with tension and nervousness. He muttered to himself, commenting that it looked like Zumo and Kao Yang were already leaving. He then turned to Ruixu, apparently by his side, saying that he wouldn't be able to hold out much longer. His voice was laden with exhaustion, and his words seemed to foreshadow some kind of collapse. Before he could continue, Lin Yi lost his balance and fell hard to the ground, causing a big thud as he hit the ground, and he said that it hurt a lot, and at that, the girl simply got down from the tree and talked about the realm of the cloud spirit. She would like to know what that place is, and then she punches the stone, because she was very stressed. Seeing that she was always after Zumo anyway, and seeing that the boy was still there, still on the ground, she shouts, ordering Lin Yi to get up soon. At this, the boy gets up and the girl walks off, telling Lin Yi that they will stay away from Zumo and go east to find out, because she wants to get to know this much talked about realm of the cloud spirit. And at this, night comes and the protagonist sets up a bonfire, and at this, he takes the furnace and sits on the ground, meditating, casting an energy into that furnace, and at this, smoke starts to come out of the furnace. At this, he simply sighs and quickly gets up, saying that everything is fine and now it's time to wait for the exile to condense, until he looks away, in a tone of doubt, and at this, Kao Yang, with a smile on her face, tells her young master that she has just arrived, and at this, she was holding a hair in her hand, and she also tells the protagonist that they must be close to the secret realm, and there are more and more cultivators appearing out there. And after that, she simply starts roasting the hair, and she comments to the protagonist that he seems restless and asks if there's anything that's making him worried, and at that, he answers the little girl, saying that there are some questions that he hasn't gotten answers to yet, and that's why he's bothered, and the girl answers the boy that she got some important information while she was outside, and the protagonist is even surprised by that. The girl goes on to say that, from what she's heard, disciples from the three sects are looking for the secret kingdom, and that, in the future, the leaders of the three sects will personally come to the Jade Dragon mountain range, and after hearing Kao Yang say this, the protagonist's eyes widen in surprise. He asks if she's talking about the three leaders, and at that, he remembers the old man saying that then, they said that an elder from the Green Vine sect had left in search of a jewel. The pendant had already been used and was now out of sight. The protagonist, with his serious posture and eyes fixed on the horizon, comments that with the return of the sect elder, the three great sects have begun to move their pieces in the intricate game of power and influence. He calmly explains to himself, while Kao Yang listens attentively, that the emergence of events such as those related to the poor area, the mysterious jade pendant, the reappearance of the Green Vine sect elder, and the mention of the legendary cloud spirit realm were all interconnected. With every word Zumo said, the complex puzzle that united these events began to make more sense. While the protagonist was immersed in his thoughts and strategic reflections, Kao Yang, with a sweet smile on her face and a lively look on her face, approached him with light steps. Without hesitation, she happily announced that the meal was ready. Zumo, still pensive, asked the young woman for a moment, explaining that the takeover of the poor area, previously belonging to the Green Vine sect, had triggered a series of unexpected reactions. He commented that this move had somehow led the Green Vine sect to discover information about the cloud spirit realm. For Zumo, everything seemed to make sense now, as if the pieces of a complicated game were finally lining up. Kao Yang, without taking her eyes off the young master, continued eating. While listening to his every word attentively, she nodded vigorously to each sentence, agreeing with everything he said, to the point of seeming like an extension of his own thoughts, almost like a reflection or a devoted shadow. It was as if she were literally Zumo's parrot, internally repeating his words. absorbing every detail with the same seriousness as he expressed it. Suddenly, something interrupted Zumo's train of thought. He stopped for a moment, frowning slightly, and then commented that he was smelling a very good aroma. The pleasant smell seemed to dominate the room, and his attention was diverted from his deep reflections to the simplicity of a sudden appetite. Without warning, his stomach rumbled audibly, drawing an amused smile from Kao Yang. Without missing a chance to tease, the girl, still smiling, picked up a piece of meat and nimbly stuffed it into Zumo's mouth, saying excitedly that there it was. The young protagonist tried to say something in response, but his voice was muffled by the food. Meanwhile, his eyes turned to the furnace in front of him. His expression changed to one of curiosity and expectation. He seemed to be analyzing something in silence, as if waiting for a result. After a short moment, a satisfied smile appeared on his face. It was a success, he declared with confidence. The pills, the result of his painstaking work, had been created to perfection. Slowly, the furnace began to open, revealing the intense glow and aromatic vapors escaping from inside. Zumo announced the name of the pills. They were the long-awaited scarlet amber herbal pills. In the next instant, a dense smoke began to escape from the furnace, enveloping the room in a misty mantle, while an even more intense glow emanated from the heart of that artifact. The protagonist stretched out his hand with precision, and the pills began to fall gently onto it, as if they were precious drops of condensed energy. He looked at the pills in his palm for a moment, examining them carefully. "The Golden Dragon Furnace is truly exceptional," he commented with a tone of admiration. Without wasting any time, he took out a specially prepared bag to store the pills, ensuring that they were safely stored, protected against any accidental loss. After saving almost all the pills, Zumo held one of them for a brief moment. Watching it in silence, his eyes seemed to shine with a mixture of strategic thinking and concern. Without warning, he threw the pill towards Kao Yang, who caught it instinctively with her hands. The girl looked at the pill in her hands, confused, and her cheeks quickly flushed before she could ask anything. Zumo spoke with a serious but gentle tone, saying that this was her reward. This was her reward. This was her reward. Kao Yang, surprised and clearly embarrassed, stammered words of refusal, trying to explain that he didn't need to do that for her, but Zumo, with a slight smile on his face, replied calmly, saying that it was necessary. He explained that if she really wanted to be useful to him in the future, it was essential that she improved her cultivation. His words were both a compliment and an order, loaded with confidence in her potential. Still with a flushed face and a mixture of emotions, Kao Yang finally nodded, promising the young master that she would do her best to follow his instructions. With newfound determination, she replied firmly, assuring him that she would work hard to become a cultivator worthy of being by his side. Zumo, satisfied with the answer, just walked back, while the girl followed him, holding the pill as if it were the greatest gift she had ever received. And then, he simply lies down next to a rock and tells her that she has 8 days and asks her to make good use of her time, and the girl is completely confused at that moment. And then, he tells her that the entrance to the secret kingdom will open in 8 days. It is only possible to use the key at that time, and Kao Yang answers the boy, saying that she will practice diligently, and she's going to start right then and there. A bluish energy starts emanating from her body, and that energy was quite intense. She was quite determined to do it, until suddenly, her belly starts rumbling, leaving her completely startled at that moment, wide-eyed, and at that, with her face completely flushed, she looks at her young master, and then, without saying a word, she approaches where the fire is and then takes another piece of meat. She says that it's okay, she thinks it will be fine if she fills her belly first, and then, while she was eating in a good way, the protagonist was sleeping a little. Then the scene changes to the eastern part of the Jade Dragon mountain range. There were the 3 leaders together on the spot, with several members of each sect. And then one of the 3 men on the left asks if that's where the secret realm of the cloud spirit is, and then the boy on the right comments to Old Man Teng that he's discovered something really fascinating this time, and then Old Man Teng comments that it was no big deal. It was all just a coincidence, and then the man gets completely excited, saying out loud that now the entrance to the secret realm has been occupied by the 3 sects, and even if Marquis Zumo possesses the pendant, he won't be able to set foot in the secret kingdom. And at that, the other leader says that with the forces of the 3 sects, It's impossible for him to get there without a flaw, and Tang says that, what's more, the treasures offered by the Secret Kingdom will be divided between the 3 sects, and the 3 leaders start laughing together at that moment, as if they had already won and Zumo couldn't do anything about it. And then the scene switches to Ko Yang, who was sleeping, until she wakes up and wonders how long she has been asleep, and then she wonders if it has been 8 days, and then she looks at the protagonist, who has his 2 hands together, concentrating an energy in them, and then she comments that she is going to get something to eat, and then she leaves the cave and starts walking through the forest, and then she hears a noise that catches her attention, so she starts chasing and quickly manages to catch it. It was a black leopard, and she was holding the black leopard by the tail. She comments that a leopard that size should be able to fill her and the protagonist's stomachs, but in fact it was practically only hers, as she eats much more than the protagonist, and the leopard, seeing the girl holding his tail, simply goes towards the girl to attack her, and the girl doesn't seem to be scared at all. She starts laughing and says to herself that it must be delicious, and at that moment she uses a skill, throwing it with everything at the leopard, who ends up flying and hitting a tree with everything. The impact was very strong and made him bleed from the mouth, and the girl, with a smile on her face, says that everything is fine and that's all for today, and then she goes off dragging that black leopard to the cave. She prepares the meat, roasts it, and then she tries it, saying that the meat is delicious. She finds that meat incredibly delicious, and then she looks at her young master and realizes that he is meditating, and then she approaches him, commenting that the young master could end up missing the day of entry to the Secret Kingdom if he doesn't wake up in time. She asks if that isn't so, but as he was meditating, he doesn't answer her, and then the girl crouches down right in front of him, her cheeks flushed. She says that he really does look like that, but her train of thought is interrupted as the protagonist gets up and talks about the Secret Kingdom, giving her quite a fright for doing so. And then the scene changes to the entrance to the Secret Kingdom. Several people were still there and Lin Yi was there, and he commented to Ryuxu that he didn't believe they had managed to infiltrate, and the girl got upset by his comment, punching him and telling him to pay attention, until the boy pointed his finger and asked her to look at it, and Ryuxu turns her face and comments that the show is about to start, and then the mustachioed leader says that it's finally complete, looking up, and then the 3 leaders release their energies through their fingertips, and a wave of yellow energy rises into the sky, and then Ko Yang asks her young master to look, pointing to the sky, and then the protagonist comments that it looks like they've already started, and then the boy, with a smile on his face, says that at the end of it all, there's one big problem: they don't have the key. And then, quickly, he begins to fly, leaving the girl completely frightened again. After all, she can never prepare for this moment, and just holds on to her young master's clothes to accompany him on the journey, and he tells the girl that they still have time and asks her to hold on tight, and the girl just misses being sick. She turns white from having run out of air, and the protagonist asks her to breathe and again asks her to hold on tight because he won't go after her if she falls, and at that, he holds her and her cheeks blush, and at that, she keeps thinking about how her young master acts towards her. She gets a smile on her face, and then she starts laughing while they fly. She seemed to be happy next to Zumo, and suddenly he tells the girl that he's going to speed up, and the little girl starts screaming, and then the scene changes to the 3 leaders, who were using their energy to open a big portal, and then the mustachioed leader, who was releasing red energy, shouts that the moment is now and everyone thinks it's great, making their energy even more intense at that moment. And with their energy enveloping the portal, a dragon appears and begins to launch an attack in front of the portal, and the portal begins to crack, and then the girl flying with her young master. She points, asking him to see, and the protagonist wonders if, after all, they were a little late. And then the girl asks the protagonist what they should do, and Zumo stops to think for a moment, and then he tells the girl that they're going to go and right after them, and then they start rushing to the supreme leader, and then the goateed old man with a talisman in his hand tells him that he's already prepared, until he throws the talisman, and they say that it's finally done, and then the protagonist is watching everything from afar, from above, and he tells the girl that it's a space-blocking talisman, and he explains that this is a very valuable spiritual talisman. Apparently, they have used everything in their power to enter the secret realm, and the girl gets a little worried, saying that if they let those men in first, but her speech is interrupted, with the young protagonist telling her not to worry about it, and he seemed to be quite unconcerned, as he even gives a smile at that moment, and he explains to her that the most valuable treasures of that secret kingdom are not something that can be obtained immediately, and at that, the goateed leader shouts for the disciples of the Burning Spirit sect, asks why they are not entering yet, and also asks what they are waiting for, and at that, the members start running, saying that they will follow the orders of the sect master. Then they call the disciples of the Green Vine sect and the disciples of the Storm sect, and Ruoxu asks Lingyi to hurry after them, elbowing the boy who quickly loses his breath. He says that it hurt, and they start running after them, until the girl realizes something and stops, and Lin-Yi asks her if anything has happened, and then she runs back saying that it's nothing, and they should go, leaving him completely confused. And then the protagonist was in the sky, watching everything, and he wondered what was going on, and the girl asked her young master what he had seen, and the protagonist said that in fact it was nothing, omitting information for the girl, and at that moment, he thought, and at the same time wondered if it was his imagination. And then the leaders started walking to enter the secret kingdom, with the old man saying that they were going to enter too. And he kept talking, without losing the smile on his face, reinforcing that within that secret kingdom, the great opportunities, those that can change destinies and define trajectories, can only be conquered through one's own abilities and individual effort. The words were spoken with unshakable confidence, as if he knew that only the strongest and most determined would be able to survive and thrive in that place. Meanwhile, the goateed leader, watching the scene with his arms crossed and a slightly haughty look on his face, responded with a touch of disdain, saying that the results would show who really had the merit and the necessary value. The tension between the words was palpable, but neither of them seemed willing to back down at that moment. Meanwhile, in a far corner, Ko Yang and Zhu Mo landed softly. After a rapid descent that seemed to have defied gravity, the two adjusted their postures, and without delay began to walk towards the portal, the point that would mark the official entrance to the secret realm. The little girl, curious and a little apprehensive, looked at her young master and asked, with a tone of voice that mixed innocence and expectation, how exactly they were going to enter that mysterious place. She was full of doubts, but also enthusiasm, because she knew that this moment would mark a new stage in her journey. Zhu Mo, with his always confident and firm posture, responded calmly, explaining to Ko Yang that they would need a special key. He then took the key from where he kept it, showing it to her, and used it, activating the mechanism that would allow them to cross to the other side. Before passing through the portal, he instructed her to hold on tight, ensuring that she understood the importance of following his instructions. The girl responds promptly, saying that she understands and, with determination, clings to what has been indicated. When they finally cross to the other side, what she sees leaves her completely fascinated, her eyes shining and her cheeks slightly flushed with emotion. Ko Yang observes the landscape ahead. She is faced with a lush forest where the trees stand tall, like guardians of a magical world, and butterflies of vibrant colors fly freely, creating a visual spectacle that seems straight out of a dream. Enchanted, the little girl exclaimed enthusiastically, asking the protagonist to look around and share in this very special moment. She couldn't contain her admiration and repeatedly said how incredible and beautiful it all was. The protagonist, however, didn't seem as impressed as she was. With a more serious tone, he reminded her that there was no time for distractions and that they needed to hurry. He explained that it was urgent to find the entrance before the other disciples did. Confused, Ko Yang asked which entrance he was talking about, but before she could get a more detailed answer, the protagonist, with quick and precise movements, began to jump. Grabbing her by the collar of her clothes, surprised and frightened, she began to scream, her voice echoing as the young master carried her with agility. During the jump, Zhu Mo took the opportunity to explain that the secret realm was divided into 9 distinct layers and that each layer had a specific entrance to the next. With a confident smile on his face, he added that he knew exactly where these entrances were located, which gave them a considerable advantage over the others. He then asked Ko Yang to hold on tightly to his back, an instruction that she begrudgingly tried to follow. Although she tried hard to obey, it was clear that the girl was not completely comfortable with the situation. situation. Meanwhile, a distant voice resounded in the room, summoning all the disciples present. The voice was firm and clear, directing the participants to spread out over the area and look for the entrance to the current layer. The promise of a reward for whoever found it first added even more tension to the situation. The protagonist, listening attentively, made a comment to himself, admitting that the other disciples seemed to be really committed to the mission. Ko Yang, hearing all this, became a little apprehensive, feeling the pressure of the challenge intensify. Suddenly, without any warning, Zumo began to descend at high speed, plunging all the way towards the ground. Her screams echoed in the air, and her expression showed a mixture of panic and disbelief at the situation. As if that wasn't enough, the protagonist, only after he had already started the descent, asked her to hold on tight, leaving her no time to even process what was happening. The girl didn't even have a chance to breathe properly, being completely taken by the moment, while the challenge only began. And then, they land, and quickly, the protagonist hides behind a tree, and when the girl, with a smile, was going to talk to him, he quickly interrupts her, asking her to be quiet. They couldn't be seen there in any way, and worried, the protagonist takes the girl and hides her by putting his hand over her mouth, so that she doesn't say another word. And also, he had heard a noise of a person passing. And then, seeing that everything was already quiet in that place, he says that they should go, but there are some things he should get first. And then, the girl is still trying to breathe at that moment, because it was all very momentary. And then, they start walking, and the protagonist tells the girl that it's that way, pulling the bush that was closing the way. And then, she is surprised, seeing a door in that place, and the protagonist explains that the entrances to the secret kingdom are hidden in places like that, and asks her not to stand still, and should approach. And the little girl answers the protagonist, saying that putting the door in such a hidden place, the person who created the secret kingdom of the cloud spirit for her, is very evil. And then we see a person behind a computer, typing the script, and then the little girl's speech comes on, which seems to be dark at the moment, saying that the person who created the secret realm of the cloud spirit is very evil. And then the young protagonist starts to break out in a cold sweat, and then he can't help himself, and he stabs the girl in the forehead, which makes her feel pain and scream at the same time, filling her eyes with tears. And he tells her not to talk such nonsense, and asks her to come in quickly. And she just answers what her master has just said. She starts walking, and is surprised to see the place. And then, while she is walking, the protagonist takes her hand, and she asks him, how are they going to find the entrance to a place like this? And suddenly, a gigantic lacria appears, and then, the protagonist tells the girl that now it's up to her. He would let her solve that impasse. And suddenly, the gigantic lacria begins to prepare a skill through its mouth to hit the little girl and Zumo. And when he was about to attack the lacria, the little girl simply throws up a gigantic block, telling that creature not to even think about getting close to her young master. And then, the scene changes to Ruxu and Linyi. He points to a spot and says that it's most likely in that direction, and the red-haired girl asks him if he's sure, and he says that his sensory abilities are, until he's simply punched in the head by the girl, and he screams, saying that it hurts. And she says that he should be more precise, and goes on to say that the immortal herb must be somewhere over there. And Lin Yi asks her how she knows that, and she's about to say that it's because of Zhu. But she stops talking and realizes something, and thinks that she's going to talk about it again, and she gets absurdly disgruntled at that moment. She thinks that Zhu Mo must be out there with that Ko Yang witch, and Lin Yi tries to talk to Ruxu. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she shouted at him, telling him to stop wasting time and get on with it. Then the girl realized something, asking if that was her. She couldn't believe that the grass had been cut. And then the scene changed to the little girl who had cut that lacria into several pieces, and she sighed at that. After all, it wasn't such a simple task. And then the protagonist, with his calm and confident demeanor, asks the girl to eat the herb he had just handed her. She, a little hesitantly, looks at him and asks if that wasn't the plant he had picked during the passage through the first layer of the secret kingdom. The protagonist, with a slight smile on his face, confirms that yes, it was exactly that. He explains that, along the way there, he had collected some items that he thought were important and could be useful, and could be useful, and could be useful. He reinforces that that particular herb would be more beneficial to her than to him, asking her to consume it without hesitation. The girl, upon hearing this, feels a wave of happiness, with her eyes shining with gratitude. She sincerely thanks the young master for his generosity and care. Without thinking twice, she takes the herb and puts it in her mouth, chewing it quickly and swallowing it in one go. Her determination in following the protagonist's instructions was evident, and her expression showed that she trusted him completely. Meanwhile, in a completely different setting, Ruixu was visibly irritated, her expression showing a mixture of frustration and impatience as she surveyed her surroundings. Her arms crossed and her countenance heavy. She couldn't believe that they had been overtaken once again. Angrily, she reflected on what had happened and began to wonder, albeit unsurely, if Zumo was also there, in the same place. Doubt consumed her, if perhaps they had not been the first to arrive. While her mind occupied itself with these questions, she tried to organize her thoughts to create a plan. In the meantime, Lin Yi, who was next to her, seemed unable to stand still. He paced back and forth, as if he was too restless to concentrate. Realizing that Ruixu was absorbed in her own thoughts, he decided to try to get her attention. Ruixu, however, does not react well to this unexpected gesture. Feeling invaded and deeply irritated, she quickly turns to him and, with an aggressive and furious tone of voice, asks him directly and threateningly what he was doing. Without giving him a chance to answer, she adds whether he was trying to die. Lin Yi, visibly flustered and not understanding the reason for such a reaction, tries to justify himself. But before he can say anything, Ruixu simply knocks him to the ground with one swift movement. Without hesitation, she throws herself on him, clearly ready to throw a few punches, while he, completely terrified, screams for her to forgive him. Still full of rage, Ruixu demands that Lin Yi stop wasting time and go immediately to find the entrance to the next level of the secret realm. She says that they need to move quickly and that there is no room for error. Trembling and trying to regain control, Lin Yi promises that he will do it as quickly as possible. But first he makes a request, almost in a pleading tone, that she at least let him get up off the ground before starting the search. Ruixu, perhaps for an instant of reflection, or just exhaustion, doesn't answer, remaining silent. Meanwhile, the scene changes again. In another location in the secret realm, the little girl was engaged in an intense battle against a gigantic scorpion. Her movements were fast, but not yet agile enough to completely overcome the attack of that frightening creature. The protagonist, attentively observing the fight, remained in an analytical position, analyzing every movement she made. He comments, with a firm but not hostile tone of voice, that her attacks were too slow and that she needed to concentrate more to improve her precision. Suddenly, the scorpion, sensing an opportunity, advances to attack the girl with its poisonous stinger. The protagonist, realizing the imminent danger, quickly warns the girl, shouting at her to beware of a blow coming from the left. The girl, hearing the warning, realizes that she didn't have many options at that moment. Determined to act, she decides to use a special technique. With determination in her eyes, she activates a powerful skill called Soul Destroyer Cloud Spirit. In one swift and devastating movement, she shreds a large part of the scorpion's body, ending the battle with an impressive blow. After the confrontation, the girl falls to her knees on the ground, breathing heavily and panting, visibly exhausted by the intensity of the fight. The protagonist, who had been watching everything carefully, seems surprised by the boldness of her decision. He makes a sincere comment, recognizing that, although risky, the choice she made was incredibly bold, and that she showed admirable courage in facing that danger. At this, the girl asks if it's over and her arm is bleeding, and suddenly, the scorpion was simply whole, attacking her again, and she quickly conjures her spear, but the scorpion simply breaks the spear she had just made with her kai, and at this, she sees the sting of that creature approaching her, but she manages to dodge, and the scorpion itself ends up being destroyed by the leap she ended up taking. At this, the protagonist says that it's enough, and he throws an energy into her hand, leaving her startled, shouting about her hand. She is completely surprised because her hand healed instantly, and then she joins her hands and thanks the young master for that, and he, being very direct, tells her that they will continue their journey at that moment, and they enter a cave. And then the protagonist says that if he remembers correctly, and then he points his index finger and launches a blue energy. And then, after that, a door appears, and he tells the little girl that in front, this time it is the third layer, and after they enter, the girl is dazzled. The place had pink-colored trees, and that makes her quite dazzled. But the protagonist puts his hand on her mouth, asking the girl to be silent and keep her focus. With his skills, he casts a kind of protective bubble on the girl and explains to her that the fragrance in that place is poisonous, meaning that the place only looked good but was actually dangerous. The girl tries to ask her young master what he meant by the fragrance being poisonous, but he doesn't listen to her and continues walking, where he comes to a weed. And then he explains to Ko Young that that hallucinogenic fragrance is a full plate for alchemists who develop poisons, and the girl, hearing him say that, replies that she understands, and then her stomach rumbles, and then he asks the girl if she's hungry, and she, a little awkwardly, says yes, she's hungry. And then the boy holds out his hand, and suddenly a magical blue tornado appears. And he told her that they were going to get to the fourth layer to rest and eat something, and then, at the entrance to the secret realm, one of the leaders was standing, while the other two were sitting, and he was really angry, telling all the subordinates that they were a bunch of idiots, and it had been 2 hours, and they still hadn't found the entrance. And then one of the subordinates explained that it was a vast realm, and finding a door there was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Zumo had his memories intact. That's why he was able to easily move around the places, and at that, the mustachioed leader says that in this case, there's only one alternative left, and at that, the other two leaders on the ground are startled by him saying that, and then, one of them asks if he means the art of divination, and the other old man with white hair says that this is a skill that consumes a lot of vital energy, and it's better for Master Lei to think a bit before drawing that conclusion. At this, Master Lei, visibly irritated, shouts, saying that he had had enough of wasting time talking, and they shouldn't forget the purpose that had brought them there, and at this, he asks what a few decades of life are compared to the great opportunities that kingdom could give. But the other leaders seem to be quite reluctant with the conclusion that Old Man Lei had come to, and suddenly he starts laughing, as if it were something super common. And then, the scene changes completely for Ruoxu. She was fighting a gigantic lion, and she manages to hit it with a bar that quickly breaks due to the impact, and at that, the lion gets very angry and then decides to attack her, and she is completely worried at that moment. She tells herself that this could not happen, until suddenly, Lin Yi shouts at her to be careful and quickly throws himself at the girl, rescuing her and protecting her from that lion's attack. However, the lion quickly gets back on its feet and goes over to the two of them to attack them, at which point the girl tries to pick up a sword she found on the ground, and so she raises the sword, which enters the mouth of the gigantic lion that wanted to swallow her and Lin Yi, at which point the lion falls a little above them, and the girl lets out a sigh. After all, she was only a stone's throw away from being attacked by that gigantic feline. At this, Lin Yi keeps repeating to himself that he's going to die, and at this, Ruoxu, completely annoyed, asks the boy how long he intends to stay on top of her, and at this, he realizes and gets a little embarrassed, and at this, he tells her that he was really just trying to save her, and at this, the girl punches him in the stomach, shouting for him to get off her. She gets up and asks the boy if he's found the door yet, and the boy, completely crestfallen, points his finger to indicate where it is and says it's that way, and the girl is surprised and starts walking through the tall grass, asking if the door is that way, and as she walks, she asks the boy if he's serious, and then the scene shifted to Ko Young, who seemed to be in a rare moment of joy and relaxation. She had just hunted a wild creature that, from the looks of it, seemed quite robust and satisfactory for a good meal. With a radiant smile on her face, she dedicated herself to preparing the meat, carefully roasting it over the fire. The aroma that emanated was delicious, filling the room and increasing the young woman's anticipation. Ko Young couldn't hide her excitement. As the smell of the roast meat grew stronger, she began to giggle to herself, almost like a child in front of a favorite dish. Her eyes sparkled and, unable to resist, she told herself enthusiastically that she was going to eat all of this herself. The thought made her salivate, and she didn't bother to hide her hunger. After a while, the meat finally seemed to be just right. Carefully, she picked up a piece that was still steaming and, with her cheeks slightly flushed with anticipation, decided to try it. As she took the first bite, her eyes widened in surprise, followed by a sigh of pleasure. She said that this was delicious, almost as if it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She was so happy that she couldn't stop smiling as she savored it. Satisfied, but curious, she turned to her young master, who was standing nearby, but seemed oblivious to the situation. He was concentrating, holding a jade in his hands, analyzing it with great care and attention. Ko Yang, with the piece of meat still in his hands, asked the young master if he would like something to eat, but without raising his eyes from the jade, the protagonist only muttered something inaudible, indicating that he was absorbed in his own thoughts. His interest in the jade was evident, and his serious expression suggested that he saw something of great importance in it. Observing the lack of response, Ko Yang tried to bring up another subject. While biting into another piece of meat, she quietly commented that she recognized that gem. She said she remembered that stone, and asked him if it wasn't the one they had found before. Noticing that he finally looked at her, she took advantage of the moment and, with curiosity, asked if he had yet to unravel the mysteries of the second layer. The young protagonist, maintaining his serene tone, replied to the girl, explaining calmly and thoroughly. He revealed that that jade was an extremely rare spiritual transformation artifact. He explained that, in addition to its unique beauty and shine, it was the best known material for refining weapons. With the jade, it would be possible to transform a simple spiritual weapon into a priceless spiritual treasure, something that could change the balance of forces in any battle. Ko Yang was surprised, his eyes wide with admiration as he processed his master's words. She said that this was incredible, clearly impressed. Her excitement was so great that she immediately asked the young master if he had already thought of a specific way to use such a powerful stone, but he replied evasively, saying that he only had a vague idea, but that he would need more time to come up with a solid plan. Meanwhile, elsewhere on the second layer, Ryuexu and Lin Yi were facing a completely opposite situation. They were in the middle of a fierce and dangerous fight against a giant scorpion. The creature, with its hard shell and sharp claws, was proving to be a formidable enemy, unleashing violent and relentless attacks. Ryuexu, determined and brave, was fighting with all her might, trying to open a gap to defeat the monster. After a long battle, she finally managed to drive her sword into the top of the scorpion's mouth. With a final roar, the creature fell heavily to the ground. Defeated, exhausted but relieved, Ryuexu looked at the fallen creature and commented, with a tone of surprise, that she hadn't expected to face so many powerful demons in the second layer. While catching her breath, she realized that Lin Yi was distracted, staring at something in the distance. Intrigued, she called him over and asked him what he was looking at so closely. Lin Yi, in a confused tone, pointed in a specific direction, mentioning that there was a strong spiritual light coming from there. Ryuexu, curious, asked him what he meant by spiritual light and took the opportunity to also ask about the door, which was what really interested her at that moment. Lin Yi, still focused on the direction of the light, replied that he didn't think it was a treasure or anything like that, but that it could be something of great importance. However, before he could elaborate further, Ryuexu, impatient and determined, began to run towards the light, saying that they had no time to lose and needed to investigate immediately. Lin Yi, surprised by his companion's impulsiveness, tried to ask her to wait, but his words were lost in the wind as she hurried away. The scene then turned back to the protagonist and Ko Yang. The two of them were sitting by the fire, the warmth of the flames gently illuminating their faces while the aroma of meat still hung in the air. Both seemed immersed in their own thoughts as the journey through the second layer continued to unfold, until suddenly the girl, her eyes wide, began to spit out a large amount of blood. The intense flow clearly weakens her, and her face expresses deep discontent. She can't help a thought that resonates in her mind like a personal charge. She couldn't possibly disappoint the young master again, determined to overcome her limitations, even in the midst of physical weakness. She begins to exude the energy she had in her body, channeling all her inner strength so as not to succumb. The protagonist, attentively observing the unexpected scene, felt surprised by what he was witnessing. In the midst of the tense moment, he noticed something extraordinary. With a penetrating gaze, he muttered to himself that this time the girl had managed to enter a state of enlightenment. The realization left him amazed, and he continued to observe her with redoubled attention, his thoughts filled with admiration as he reflected suspected that, with such a resilient temperament and such a rare natural talent, she was undoubtedly a person of inestimable value for cultivation. While the girl concentrates, using every drop of energy to strengthen herself and continue on her way, the protagonist decides to act to help her. He reaches out towards her and begins to heal her, using all the means at his disposal. Although the resources available to him are not unlimited, he does his utmost so that the girl doesn't become even more debilitated after that intense effort. The scene was charged with tension and dedication, showing the bond and care he had for his disciple. The narrative then shifts focus to another point, the attention falling on the leaders, who were still on the ground, clearly frustrated with the situation. Lei, visibly irritated, complained loudly that 2 hours had passed and, until that moment, there was no sign of the door they were looking for. The discouragement in the group was palpable, but their patience was running out. One of the leaders, finally unable to stand the wait any longer, stood up with determination, his voice carrying revolt as he stated that everyone there was nothing but a bunch of useless people, and that, apparently, there was no alternative but to resort to that secret technique that everyone feared. The leader's words quickly generated tension among those present, and Teng, with his analytical posture, intervened. He explains that, according to the detailed calculations he has made, each of the people involved would need to sacrifice 10 years of their own life for the technique to be effective. The revelation takes the group by surprise, and one of the men can't hide his shock at hearing it. He complains, saying that the price to be paid is absurdly high, but the old man in the group firmly refutes this, saying that, as this is a secret kingdom, it was obvious that the costs would be high. This was no simple challenge. The rewards, as well as the sacrifices, were proportional to the magnitude of the place. The goateed leader, showing impatience, interrupts the debate and declares, with an authoritarian tone, that there was enough hesitation. He orders them to start once and for all. The tension in the room grows as 2 of the leaders sit on the floor, assuming a cross-legged posture. They put their hands together, touching their fingertips to each other, and began to channel a powerful and dense energy. The energy emanating was almost understandable, like an invisible force that filled the surrounding space. Another leader, seeing that the process had already begun, decided to join the effort. He sat down and repeated the same gestures as the other 2, forming a triangle of intense energy. Finally, the portal began to open, revealing the location of the long-awaited door. One of those present, observing the phenomenon, commented that the entrance was located in an extremely secret place, almost inaccessible to those who didn't have privileged information. Meanwhile, the scene returns to Kao Yang, who finally opens her eyes. The gleam in her eye indicates that something has changed inside her. She notices the presence of the young master next to her, protecting her, and, with a soft tone of voice, asks him if she was really being protected all along. The protagonist, for his part, doesn't answer directly. He just watches the girl with an expression that mixed curiosity and satisfaction. Kao Yang, noticing the silence, turns to face him directly. He then calmly asks if she has woken up. The girl, with a determined countenance, replies yes. The protagonist, satisfied with the answer, states that, in that case, there was no more time to lose. Without hesitation, he declares that they would go straight to the 5th layer, demonstrating that the journey was just beginning and that even greater challenges awaited them. The girl says that everything is fine, and then, just as they are about to go to the 5th layer, her stomach starts rumbling, causing them both to fall into a deafening silence at that moment, and then the scene switches to Ruixu and she is wide-eyed, saying that they have arrived and she is hiding in a rock. She starts analyzing the place and gets upset because there are desert dragon lizards there. At this, she stares and thinks about her old memories. When Zumo told her that the desert dragon lizards are extremely special demonic creatures, and at this, she thinks that again she was thinking about Zumo and gets upset about it. And at this, Lin Yi, seeing that she was looking so angry, asks her what the problem is, and at this, the girl points to the dragon and says that right in the cave behind them is where the legendary jade of spiritual transformation is. And Lin Yi, completely overwhelmed by confusion after hearing what Roxu had just said, asked her incredulously how she knew that, but the girl, without paying much attention to the boy's doubt, diverted the conversation and insisted on something that seemed more relevant to her at that moment. She asked how they were going to sneak up to the place they were observing, deliberately ignoring his question. Before he could answer or even formulate any plans, something caught his eye. He was startled and, pointing his finger in a specific direction, asked Ruoxu to look. With her curiosity aroused, she asked him what he was seeing. They both looked at each other and realized something impressive. Several people were flying at that very moment, gliding through the air in a fluid and determined manner. The two of them, overcome by surprise and admiration, just watched, without showing any other reaction for a few moments. Among the figures in the air, the leaders stood out with their imposing presences. They were grouped together, clearly focused on something. It was then that the white-haired old man, showing unshakable confidence, said that his perception was correct. He believed that in that mysterious cave in front of them, there must be precious gems and spiritual minerals, items of inestimable value to everyone present. However, before they could proceed with their plans, the desert dragon lizard guarding the entrance to the cave let out a deafening roar, echoing throughout the surrounding area. The sound was so powerful that the leaders were briefly taken aback and tense, but the white-haired old man, determined not to be intimidated by the gigantic creature, nimbly drew his sword and shouted, encouraging everyone else. He said that the treasures they were looking for were right in front of them and that they should attack without hesitation. Inspired by his words, the group of leaders began a massive attack on the dragon lizard, driven by the desire to conquer what was inside the cave. Meanwhile, Lin Yi, who was watching the scene, decided to start moving. He urgently commented that they couldn't allow the group of leaders to reach the treasures before them. However, before he could take more than 2 steps, Ruoxu firmly grasps his arm, asking him to wait. With a quick and unexpected movement, she ends up pulling him back, and the boy almost brushes against her, generating a moment of tension. Irritated by the proximity, Ryuxu gets angry and calls Lin Yi shameless, scolding him with all the strength she had. As punishment for his supposed audacity, she unleashes a powerful kick, which sends the boy flying into the air before falling awkwardly to the ground. Poor Lin Yi, visibly dejected, and with an expression of pain and dismay, laments his situation. He tearfully tries to justify his actions, saying that he was just afraid that the others would get there first, and that's why he had rushed. Ruoxu, on the other hand, maintains her firm posture and sternly tells Lin Yi that he shouldn't underestimate the desert dragon lizard. The creature was incredibly powerful and should not be taken lightly. Then the narrative changes, and attention turns to Ko Yang, who was open-mouthed, completely amazed by the grandeur and beauty of the place she was in. She, impressed by the surrounding landscape, looks at the protagonist and, with a certain insecurity, asks her young master if there was anything specific she should be careful of in that mysterious place. The protagonist, with a serious expression, replies in a direct manner. He says that the most important thing was that she didn't move away from him, whatever happened. Ko Yang, his cheeks slightly flushed by the closeness and seriousness of his master's words, takes his hand and, with a determined tone of voice, says that he understands perfectly. The two then start walking together, attentive to what they might find. Suddenly, a thick and mysterious smoke begins to rise around them, quickly covering the area. Ko Yang, frightened, looks around for the young master, but can no longer see him. Panic momentarily overwhelms her, and she desperately shouts to ask what is going on. Zhu Mo's answer comes in a calm but serious tone. He explains that it was an enchanted mist, a dangerous and treacherous phenomenon. He adds that a single false step could cause her to be trapped in that place forever, with no chance of return. Upon hearing this, Ko Yang is completely stunned, her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open in shock. Fear begins to take hold of her. Realizing the girl's state, the protagonist continues, explaining that there was only one way to escape that danger. He instructs her to hold on tightly to his hand and emphasizes that, under no circumstances, should she move away. His words bring a mixture of comfort and urgency, making it clear that, despite the danger, he was there to protect her. Ko Yang, trying to control the fear she felt, clings to the young master's hand tightly, determined to follow his instructions and trust him, even in the midst of the unknown. The frightened girl just continues to hold his hand, but he starts to move quickly, making the poor girl dizzy, and then he puts his feet on the ground after a jump and says that they have arrived, and they are facing a waterfall, and the girl asks the protagonist what that is, and Zumo answers Ko Young, saying that it is the treasure of that layer, which is called the sacred sun fluid, and then he touches the water, saying that bathing in it will drastically improve the longevity of whoever touches it. Thanks to the increase in spiritual power, and in Ko Young's case, it will refine the essence and stabilize the foundation, and when she hears the protagonist saying this, she is completely confused, asking if he is really talking about her, and then she starts to deny it, telling the young master to make himself at home, because the sacred sun fluid is all his, and in the midst of the tension of the moment, the protagonist turns his attention to the girl next to him, and, with a serene expression on his face, says that it would be a complete waste for him to use it alone. He adds that there would be no problem in her using it too, sharing the resource with him. The statement takes the girl by surprise, leaving her completely stunned. Her eyes widen slightly, and her thoughts scramble as she tries to process what she has just heard. In her mind, the idea of wearing something so special alongside her young master was both surreal and intimidating. She felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement, but quickly tried to control her emotions so as not to show too much. Soon, they both began to prepare for what was to come, adjusting their postures and mentalizing what they would do. With one last look at the grandiose waterfall ahead, they decided to throw themselves under its crystal clear and powerful waters. However, before they can continue, the scene suddenly changes, shifting the focus to another setting. In this new place, the leaders and their respective team members were in full combat against the gigantic desert dragon lizard, a majestic and terrifying creature that was fiercely defending the entrance to the cave where priceless treasures were hidden. The battle was intense, despite the coordinated efforts of the leaders and their subordinates. The creature was extremely resistant, refusing to give in. After a joint effort, they finally managed to tie the dragon lizard, partially restricting its movements. Taking advantage of this opening, the members begin to deliver a series of direct blows against the monster, trying to weaken it. However, this offensive only infuriates the creature even more. In response, the dragon lizard lets out a deafening and powerful roar, unleashing a wave of impact so intense that several limbs are flung away. Among those hit was Ruixu, who, although she tried to resist, was unable to avoid the blow. She ended up spitting blood due to the impact she suffered, demonstrating that the force of the attack was truly devastating. Lin Yi, realizing Ruixu's condition, rushes over to her, visibly worried. With a tone of urgency, he asks if she's all right, examining her carefully. The pink-haired girl, however, plays down the situation. Even though she's injured, she replies that she's fine and, with a glint of determination in her eyes, affirms that the opportunity they've been waiting for has finally arrived. Without wasting any time, she explains to Lin Yi that she knows a technique capable of blocking their presence, allowing them to pass unnoticed in that dangerous environment. Lin Yi, still trying to assimilate what she has just said, looks at her with an expression of doubt and hesitation. He wasn't sure if that strategy would work, but he had no choice but to trust her. While he reflected, Ruixu was already starting to walk with firm steps, guiding him towards the place they had to reach. When they finally reach their destination, the girl can't contain her excitement, her eyes shining. She exclaims enthusiastically when she sees what is in front of them, a very high-quality spiritual jade. Ruixu approaches carefully, reaching out to take the spiritual jade. However, just as her fingers are about to touch it, something strange happens. The jade suddenly disappears, as if it had never been there, and reappears somewhere else. Confused, Ruixu looked back, trying to understand what had happened, and her expression reflected a mixture of frustration and surprise, at which point the scene changed, back to the protagonist and Ko Young, who were standing under the waterfall. The setting was now completely different, with a more serene atmosphere. Although there was still a subtle tension in the air, there they were, immersed in the spiritual waters, taking what seemed to be a purifying bath. Ko Young, however, didn't look completely comfortable. She kept her head down, her shoulders slightly bowed, as if she was trying to hide something or protect herself from her own thoughts, while the protagonist kept his eyes closed, appearing completely calm and focused. Ko Young, her face slightly reddened, was thinking to herself. She whispered softly, almost inaudibly, that it was a very good thing that there was a spiritual curtain separating the two of them. This invisible barrier seemed to bring her some relief, allowing her to feel more at ease. With a discreet sigh, she tried to convince herself that everything was fine and that she should start her part of the process. Taking courage, Ko Young began to exhale his spiritual energy. The sensation was intense, and she struggled to keep her focus. The protagonist, noticing the movement next to him, commented that he would be able to absorb a third of that energy. He then takes a special pill and puts it in his mouth, saying out loud that it's time to start. In an instant, he too begins to exhale his energy, causing the surrounding environment to begin to change. Suddenly, something impressive happens. An energy spiral begins to form in the waters around them, generating an extraordinary reaction. She had never seen anything like it before, and she couldn't contain her admiration for what she was witnessing. The spiritual waters, once calm, were now swirling intensely, as if they were responding to the powerful presence and energy of the protagonist. And the protagonist continued meditating and concentrating all the energy he had, until this energy begins to rise, like a giant beam of light. And then the girl is analyzing it, and she says to herself that it seems that the young master has already surpassed the spiritual realm. And then she feels a bravery inside her, and says that she too has to make a commitment. And then she continues meditating and exhaling energy everywhere, and suddenly, she's wide-eyed and starts coughing and spitting up blood. And at that moment, she even catches the eye of the protagonist, who opens his eyes and looks in the direction where the girl is, and he sees that the girl has fainted. So he quickly goes over to her and picks her up, and he stares at her and tries to understand what's going on. The narrative shifts to a new setting. Located in a vast cave in the second layer of the secret realm, there were Ling Yi and Ruixu, both surrounded by a heavy and mysterious atmosphere. The girl, still frustrated by recent events, stared at the spiritual jade that seemed so close and yet unreachable, her eyes shining with a mixture of indignation and confusion as she reflected on what was happening. After a few moments of reflection, Ruixu, visibly irritated, looks at Ling Yi with a serious expression full of frustration. Without hesitation, she asks how a situation like that could be happening, and, before the boy can even try to answer, she concludes that someone has crossed his path. Ruixu clenches her fists tightly, her anger overflowing with every word. She approaches the rocky wall next to her and, in a fit of frustration, throws a powerful punch against the cold, hard surface, the impact echoing throughout the cave, and then she screamed, saying that someone had stolen the jade, her voice filled with indignation. She also said that they had only left an illusion to fool whoever was after her. That's why she hadn't been able to get the jade before. The girl couldn't hide her irritation at the situation, while Lin Yi stood watching her with a worried expression, trying to think of a solution. The boy, in a thoughtful tone, raises the hypothesis that there could be other experts besides the three great sects in that secret realm. However, before Ruixu could answer or reflect on the question, a sudden deafening sound echoes throughout the cave, abruptly interrupting the conversation. The noise was so intense that it seemed to make the entire structure of the cave tremble. Both young men were alarmed, their eyes wide as they tried to understand what was happening. "They've brought down the desert dragon lizard," Lin Yi whispered, his voice filled with disbelief and discontent. Without wasting any more time, the boy quickly grabbed Ruixu's hand, pulling her away from there. "They've won. We need to get out of here right now," he exclaimed hurriedly. They both started running through the winding passages of the cave, trying to avoid any unwanted encounters. However, in the middle of their escape, a new noise caught Ruixu's attention, who instinctively stopped running and leaned against the rocky wall, trying to hide. Lin Yi, without time to react, ended up glued to the girl due to the sudden proximity. The situation left him completely unpleased, his face becoming intensely flushed as he looked away, trying to avoid any further embarrassment. Meanwhile, the footsteps and voices of other individuals echoed through the cave, making the tension even more understandable. One of the leaders, visibly panting and exhausted, appeared in their sight. He was coughing hoarsely, trying to catch his breath after the intense confrontation with the dragon lizard. Behind him, Another leader grumbled, his voice laden with frustration and fatigue. He commented that this creature was much more powerful than they had expected. The older leader, with his completely white hair and serious expression, wasted no time and ordered everyone to move on. Lin Yi, hiding next to Ruoxu, watched the scene with apprehension. He commented that they were heading for the treasure, but before he could continue his train of thought, Ruoxu, in one swift movement, covered his mouth with her hand. With an alarmed look on her face, she whispered to him to keep absolutely silent. For the girl, if they find the two of them, they will be lost. Things could get even worse. The tension between the two of them was growing by the second, and their physical proximity only made the situation even more uncomfortable for Lin Yi. He felt his face burn with embarrassment. His cheeks completely flushed as he tried to look away. The tight and unexpected position they were in made his heart race, although he knew that this was not the time for distractions. The scene then changes again, this time focusing on the young protagonist, who was holding Ko Yang tightly. He was watching her attentively, a serious expression on his face. As he reflected on her condition, she thought that she really hadn't expected an outcome like this. Assessing the situation, the girl's body was suffering an adverse reaction, something he couldn't fully explain at that moment. His mind worked quickly, considering the possibilities and trying to find a solution to help Ko Yang. After a few moments of reflection, he seemed to come to a decision. There is only one solution left, he said out loud, more to convince himself than anything else. With determination, he reached out his hand, positioning it next to the girl's torso. Little by little, it began to emanate a bright, pulsating yellow energy, which radiated warmth and serenity around them. The golden light illuminated the room, creating a striking contrast with the gloomy atmosphere of the place they were in. And at that, the girl suddenly wakes up, and then she gets up quickly and realizes, commenting that she really did pass out while she was in that liquid. And at that, she realizes that there's something wrong. She asks herself how she was dressed with her cheeks flushed, until she looks to the side and sees her young master, but she sees a light shining brightly, to the point of bothering her eyes, until she realizes something. She asks if it was the young master who had put the dress on her, and at that moment, she goes into despair, getting wide-eyed and her mouth open. And at that moment, she was completely in shock, her voice completely choked up. She didn't even know what to say to the protagonist. However, she started to get dizzy. She looked at her own hands and talked about her body, and at that, the protagonist said that as he was saying, there was a problem in her body, and at that, the young protagonist put his 2 fingers near her head and started to emanate an energy, and she told the protagonist that, and she ended up delaying him again. She felt quite guilty about it. The young protagonist, with his serene and determined expression, responds to the girl who is watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He calmly explains that he has temporarily sealed her spiritual power to prevent her body from suffering any further damage. He holds the plant in front of her, revealing that it would be essential for the complete recovery of the young woman's weakened body. With a gentle look, he asks Ko Yang if she remembers a previous conversation, where he mentioned that there was a special, almost legendary herb capable of helping to regenerate the body and spirit. She asks, with a slightly shaky voice, if that really is the famous jade-colored herb, something she only knew about from legends and stories told by her elders. The protagonist, with a slight smile on his face, firmly confirms, answering that it is. And then he says that he harvested that herb behind the waterfall after crossing that violently flowing river, and says that it is a gift for her. However, Ko Yang's reaction is not one of immediate joy. Instead, her expression changes to a mixture of guilt and worry. She protests, saying that he went through so much trouble just because of her, as if his effort was a burden she didn't want to carry. The protagonist, sensing the girl's discomfort, shakes his head gently and interrupts her before she can blame herself any further. He patiently explains that she shouldn't think so. In fact, his original plan was to use the herb to create a more general purpose medicine, but considering the circumstances, he decided that the priority was to save her. With a more serious expression, he adds that, unfortunately, there is now only one method left to use the herb, and this method would involve intense and deep pain. Ko Yang, upon hearing the young master's words, feels the weight of the moment, but doesn't hesitate. Gathering all the courage within her, she raises her gaze and responds bravely, saying that she is willing to endure any suffering, if that is the only way to her recovery. Determined, she declares that she would do what is necessary without hesitation and suggests that they begin the procedure immediately. The protagonist, aware of the seriousness of what was about to happen, asks her gently to remove her clothes so that the process can begin. At first, the girl responds confidently, quickly agreeing, but a few seconds later, she processes the request better and goes into a state of absolute shock. Her expression of confidence gives way to a mixture of panic and embarrassment, and she begins to scream, completely bewildered by the situation. For her, the idea of removing her clothes in front of the young master was something that had never crossed her mind, and she couldn't understand why. Without understanding that the request was purely medical and necessary for the healing procedure, Ko Young questions the protagonist, his voice full of nervousness, asking why she would have to do this. She's still trying to process the situation. The young master, for his part, sighs deeply, realizing the misunderstanding, and patiently explains that the clothes need to be removed to prevent them from freezing or spoiling during the procedure. He tries to use a light and objective tone, but the situation was clearly uncomfortable for both of them. Despite the explanations, Ko Young remains uncomfortable, still trying to overcome the embarrassment. Finally, the protagonist mentions that he himself had to put clothes back on her on another occasion to protect her, which only increases the girl's embarrassment. Irritated, she responds quickly, saying that she has already understood, but still maintains an air of indignation and discomfort. Reluctantly, but aware of the importance of the moment, Ko Young finally does what is necessary. After preparing herself, she announces that she is ready, enveloped in a dense spiritual mist that fills the room. She holds her head high. Although her eyes still reveal traces of nervousness, she tells them to get on with it. She says it, trying to keep calm and also to build up courage, despite the noticeable tension in her voice. The young master approaches her, assuming a firm and focused posture. He explains that the next step will be the most difficult, but he doesn't give many details. He just places the jade herb on the girl's back. With extreme care, the moment the herb touches her skin, a powerful energy is released, causing an intense and penetrating pain. Ko Young screams, her body reacting instinctively to the impact of that overwhelming energy. The pain was real, but at the same time, she felt something deeper with the transformation beginning to unfold inside her, as if the herb was activating something that had remained dormant. And suddenly, she felt as if she were being pulled into the water, and she thought that she was feeling absurdly cold at that moment. And at that, she closes her eyes and opens them, and suddenly, she hears from the protagonist that she should stay conscious. And then, the girl goes wide-eyed because she was worried at that moment. And then, she thinks that she should hold on. She tries to get it through her head because she was doing it for her young master. And then, after the girl simply freezes, the protagonist tells himself that everything is now in the hands of fate, and at that moment, the scene changes to where the leaders were, and they get very angry, asking if there's nothing, literally nothing, and he wonders, completely in shock, how this is happening. And at that moment, Ruixu and Lin Yi were in the cave too, hiding, and the girls were apprehensive, thinking that the breath restriction technique won't last for long. And then, one of the leaders, who was a little bruised, asks if perhaps someone took advantage of them while they were fighting and sneaked in there, and then the boys, hearing him say that, quickly become worried. After all, if they found the two of them there, it would be the end of them. And then the leader says that they are probably still in the cave, and then the other leader tells everyone to check using the lighting technique, and the girl goes into shock, thinking that this is a horrible situation. It really isn't good. And then the leader says that he's really curious to know who did it, and then someone shouts that they're reporting and notifies them that it's urgent news, telling the masters of the sect, and suddenly, the scene changes to where Ko Young and the protagonist were, and then the glass starts to crack, and he doesn't understand. In a tone of doubt, he comments to himself that the girl is awakening, and then the girl opens her eyes, and then her energy ends up breaking all that ice that had been created in her, and the light that begins to radiate from her is so strong that he shields his vision and can't understand what has just happened.